More than 1 billion people around the world follow a faith that began in the Arabian Peninsula over 14 centuries ago. At the center of this story is Muhammad, a man born in the city of Mecca whose life would have a lasting impact on human history. But before he became known as a prophet, Muhammad lived as a merchant, a husband, and a member of a rapidly changing society. His story is not only one of faith, but also of personal struggle, reflection, and the search for meaning. According to Islamic tradition, everything changed during a period of solitude in a mountain cave, where Muhammad received the first revelations that would form the foundation of Islam. From that moment, a new religious movement began, one that would eventually spread far beyond Arabia and shape the lives of millions across the centuries. In this documentary, we will explore the early life of Muhammad and the events that led to the beginning of one of the world's major religions. And as we follow this story, perhaps we should ask, how can the experiences of a single individual change the course of history for generations to come? Islam, a faith embraced by over 1.5 billion people across the globe, represents a significant portion of humanity. Despite its immense reach and profound influence on history and culture, many in the Western world often find themselves with a limited understanding of its origins and the figure at its heart, Muhammad. While names like Jesus and Buddha resonate widely, the story of Muhammad, the final prophet in Islamic tradition, remains somewhat less explored in broader narratives. This documentary aims to bridge that knowledge gap, not to advocate or convert, but to offer a neutral, historical, and traditionally informed account of how Muhammad became the prophet of Islam, providing context and insight into a spiritual journey that reshaped a civilization. The setting for this pivotal story is the Arabian Peninsula, a vast expanse of deserts, oases, and ancient trade routes, roughly 1400 years ago. This was a land characterized by a tribal society where one's identity was intrinsically linked to their clan and lineage, much like how modern individuals identify with their nationality, whether Russian, South African, or Brazilian. These tribes were the fundamental units of social and political organization, dictating alliances, conflicts, and daily life. Within this intricate web of tribal loyalties and rivalries, there existed a city that held a unique position, Mecca. Mecca was not just a prominent trade hub, strategically located along major caravan routes, but also a spiritual center. It housed the Kaaba, a cubic structure revered even in pre-Islamic times as a sanctuary containing idols representing various deities worshipped by the polytheistic Arab tribes. This made Mecca a place of pilgrimage and a crossroads of cultures and beliefs. As we delve into the life of Muhammad, it is important to address the visual representation of prophets in Islam. Unlike some other traditions, Islamic art generally avoids anthropomorphic depictions of prophets, including Muhammad. This practice stems from a desire to prevent idolatry and to maintain a focus on the divine message rather than the messenger's physical form. Therefore, when we speak of Muhammad, we are describing a historical figure through the lens of tradition and textual accounts, allowing the narrative itself to paint a picture of his character and experiences. Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abd al-Muttalib ibn Hashim was born in Mecca around the year 570 CE. His birth was marked by a series of unfortunate events that would shape his early life profoundly. His father Abdullah died before Muhammad was born, leaving his mother Amina to raise him. At the tender age of 6, Muhammad also lost his mother. This left him an orphan, a status that carried significant challenges in a society where tribal protection and family lineage were paramount. Following his mother's death, his grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, a respected elder of the Quraysh tribe, took him in. However, this guardianship was also brief, as Abd al-Muttalib passed away when Muhammad was just 8 years old. It was then that his uncle, Abu Talib, assumed responsibility for his upbringing. Abu Talib, though not wealthy, provided Muhammad with love and protection, integrating him into his own family. Growing up, Muhammad did not experience the privileged life of some other children in Mecca. He reportedly worked as a shepherd, a humble profession that often fell to those without significant means. Later, he became involved in trade, accompanying his uncle on caravan journeys. These travels exposed him to different cultures and peoples, broadening his horizons beyond the confines of Mecca. Throughout his youth and early adulthood, Muhammad developed a reputation for exceptional honesty and integrity. He was known for his trustworthiness and fair dealings, earning him the honorific title Al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy. This reputation was so strong that people would bring their disputes to him for arbitration, confident in his impartial judgment. One famous incident that cemented his reputation as a fair mediator occurred when the Kaaba was being rebuilt. After the walls were erected, the tribes of Mecca vied for the honor of placing the sacred black stone back into its corner. This disagreement threatened to escalate into a violent conflict. Muhammad, then around 35 years old, was consulted. He resolved the dispute ingeniously by laying his cloak on the ground, placing the black stone upon it, and then asking representatives from each tribe to hold a corner of the cloak. Together they lifted the stone to the Kaaba, and Muhammad himself then placed it into position. This simple yet profound act averted bloodshed and demonstrated his wisdom and diplomatic skills, further solidifying his standing as a man of peace and justice. As Muhammad approached his 40th year, he began to seek solitude more frequently. He would retreat to a cave called Hira, located on Jabal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light, just outside Mecca. There he would spend hours in contemplation, meditating on the spiritual emptiness he perceived in the idol worship prevalent in his society, and reflecting on the meaning of life and the divine. This period of intense introspection set the stage for the most profound experience of his life. According to Islamic tradition, it was during one of these retreats in the year 610 CE that Muhammad received his first revelation. While he was in the cave, an angelic figure, later identified as the Archangel Gabriel, appeared before him. Gabriel commanded him, "Iqra," which means read or recite. Muhammad, startled and terrified, responded, "I am not one of those who read," or "I cannot read." Gabriel repeated the command forcefully, pressing Muhammad until he felt as though he would suffocate. Again, Muhammad protested his inability. For a third time, Gabriel commanded him, and then recited the first 5 verses of what would become Surah Al-Alaq, the 96th chapter of the Quran. "Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not." Overwhelmed and trembling, Muhammad rushed home to his wife Khadija, seeking comfort and reassurance. He cried out, "Cover me, cover me." Khadija, a wise and supportive woman, listened patiently as he recounted the terrifying encounter. She immediately recognized the profound significance of his experience. She consoled him, affirming his good character and integrity, saying that God would never abandon one who upheld such virtues. To further reassure him, she took him to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nofal, an elderly learned Christian who was familiar with scriptures and prophecies. Upon hearing Muhammad's account, Waraka immediately recognized the divine nature of the revelation, declaring that this was the same angel who had appeared to Moses, and that Muhammad was indeed the prophet of his people. This initial revelation marked the beginning of Muhammad's prophethood. For the next 23 years, he would continue to receive divine messages, which were meticulously memorized and recorded by his companions, eventually forming the Quran, the holy book of Islam. The early years of his prophetic mission were fraught with challenges. He began by secretly sharing the message of monotheism, the belief in one God, Allah in Arabic, with his closest family and friends. Khadija was the first to believe, followed by his cousin Ali, his adopted son Zaid, and his close friend Abu Bakr. As the number of converts grew, Muhammad began to preach openly, calling on the people of Mecca to abandon their idol worship and embrace the singular God. This message, however, was met with fierce resistance from the Quraysh, the dominant tribe of Mecca. Their wealth and power were closely tied to the polytheistic practices and the pilgrimage associated with the Kaaba. They saw Muhammad's message as a direct threat to their economic interests, social order, and ancestral traditions. The early Muslims faced severe persecution, including boycotts, public harassment, and even physical torture. Despite these hardships, Muhammad and his followers remained steadfast in their faith, enduring years of opposition and ostracization. One of the most miraculous events in Islamic tradition, occurring approximately 10 years into his prophethood, is the Isra and Miraj, the night journey and ascension. Islamic texts state that Muhammad was miraculously transported from Mecca to Jerusalem in a single night. From Jerusalem, he then ascended through the heavens, encountering prophets like Moses, Jesus, and Abraham, and eventually standing before God. During this celestial journey, the 5 daily prayers, a cornerstone of Islamic practice, were instituted. This event served to strengthen Muhammad's resolve and reassure his followers during a period of intense persecution, demonstrating divine support for his mission. It also solidified the status of Jerusalem as a holy city in Islam, second only to Mecca and Medina. The culmination of Muhammad's early mission in Mecca was the Hijra, or migration, in 622 CE. Facing unrelenting persecution and a plot to assassinate him, Muhammad and his followers secretly departed Mecca for the city of Yathrib, later renamed Medina, meaning the city of the Prophet. This journey marked a pivotal turning point in Islamic history. The people of Medina, who had sent delegations to Muhammad inviting him to their city as an arbitrator and prophet, welcomed him with open arms. The Hijra is so significant that it marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, Muhammad was not only a spiritual leader but also a statesman and military commander. He established a new social order, uniting the warring tribes of Medina under the banner of Islam and drafting the Constitution of Medina, a document that outlined the rights and responsibilities of the diverse communities, including Muslims, Jews and pagans, living in the city. This marked the establishment of the first Islamic state. From Medina, Muhammad continued to spread the message of Islam, engaging in a series of conflicts with the Meccans, who sought to crush the nascent Muslim community. Over time, through a combination of military victories, strategic alliances, and diplomatic efforts, the influence of Islam grew. By 630 CE, Muhammad led a triumphant return to Mecca. Instead of exacting revenge on his former persecutors, he offered general amnesty, cleansed the Kaaba of idols, and established Mecca as the spiritual heart of Islam. In the remaining years of his life, Muhammad consolidated the Islamic State, unified the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam, and continued to receive revelations that completed the Quran. He passed away in Medina in 632 CE, leaving behind a profound legacy, a monotheistic faith, a comprehensive legal and ethical system, and a vibrant community that would go on to shape the course of world history. His life, from his humble beginnings as an orphan to his ascension as a prophet and statesman, is a testament to the transformative power of faith and leadership, rooted in the desert sands of Arabia. Nearly 2 billion people across every continent identify as Muslims today, making Islam the second largest and one of the fastest growing religions on earth. This vast community stretches from the crowded streets of Cairo to the quiet mosques of rural Indonesia, from the ancient Medinas of Morocco to the vibrant Muslim communities in North America and Europe. This sheer breadth compels a question. How did a single man, born in a remote desert city more than 14 centuries ago, give rise to a movement of such extraordinary reach and enduring power? For some, Islam resonates as deeply familiar, while for others it remains entirely foreign. Regardless of one's background, the story of its origins demands careful, honest attention. Despite Islam's enormous global presence, many outside the Muslim world know surprisingly little about the historical circumstances of its founding. Popular culture often reduces Muhammad to a symbol, either revered or controversial, without truly examining the human being behind the narrative. Our approach here is different. To understand Muhammad as a historical figure, deeply embedded in a specific time, place, and culture, the inquiry is not whether his claims were true or false, but rather how a man of his background and character came to make them, and why so many in his lifetime and afterward chose to believe him. This perspective frames our exploration with curiosity, rigor, and respect, rather than devotion or polemic. The historical legacy of Muhammad's mission is undeniable. Within a generation of his death, the Arabian Peninsula was transformed. The early Islamic Empire expanded rapidly across the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and eventually into Europe and Central Asia. Islamic civilization profoundly influenced science, philosophy, architecture, law, and literature, leaving an indelible mark on human progress. Historians across traditions, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, secular, and others, consistently rank Muhammad among the most influential human beings who ever lived. This is not a theological judgment, but a historical one, based on the measurable impact of his life and teachings on the trajectory of human civilization, justifying the depth of the inquiry that follows. To reconstruct Muhammad's life, historians rely on a range of primary sources, including the Quran, the Hadith collections, early biographies such as Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, and the historical chronicles of later Muslim scholars. It is important to acknowledge the challenges inherent in this endeavor. Most written sources date from at least a century after Muhammad's death, and they were composed within communities of belief rather than by neutral observers. Archaeological evidence for 7th century Arabia is limited. This does not mean the story cannot be told, but it does mean that historians must work carefully, distinguishing between what is well attested, what is traditional, and what remains uncertain. This honesty about sources establishes the intellectual credibility of our narrative and sets expectations for the neutral language that will follow. We are about to travel back 14 centuries to a world of desert heat, caravan trade, tribal loyalty, and spiritual searching. We will meet a man who was, before anything else, an orphan, a merchant, a husband, and a thinker. We will watch him wrestle with the world around him, retreat into silence, and emerge with a message that would divide and ultimately transform his society. Whether one is a believer, a skeptic, or simply a curious person, by the end of this journey, the emergence of Islam will no longer feel like a mystery. It will feel like something deeply, recognizably human. Chaological evidence for 7th century Arabia is limited. This does not mean the story cannot be told, but it does mean that historians must work carefully, distinguishing between what is well attested, what is traditional, and what remains uncertain. This honesty about sources establishes the intellectual credibility of our narrative and sets expectations for the neutral language that will follow. We are about to travel back 14 centuries to a world of desert heat, caravan trade, tribal loyalty, and spiritual searching. We will meet a man who was, before anything else, an orphan, a merchant, a husband, and a thinker. We will watch him wrestle with the world around him, retreat into silence, and emerge with a message that would divide and ultimately transform his society. Whether one is a believer, a skeptic, or simply a curious person, by the end of this journey, the emergence of Islam will no longer feel like a mystery. It will feel like something deeply recognizably human. The Arabian Peninsula in the late 6th and early 7th centuries was a land of stark contrasts. Vast, unforgiving deserts stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by scattered oases that supported fragile communities. Yet, these harsh conditions also fostered a robust culture of resilience, self-reliance, and intricate social structures. The Bedouin, nomadic tribes who roamed the desert, lived by a strict code of honor, hospitality, and vengeance. Their lives revolved around their camels, their flocks, and the ever-present threat of scarcity and intertribal conflict. Poetry was their most revered art form, a powerful tool for preserving history, celebrating heroism, and even engaging in verbal warfare. Orators and poets held immense prestige, their words capable of igniting passions or forging truces. Amidst this nomadic backdrop, a few urban centers had begun to flourish, primarily due to their strategic positions along ancient trade routes. Mecca, in particular, stood out. It was not a fertile oasis, but its location at the crossroads of major commercial arteries, connecting Yemen to the south with Syria and Palestine to the north, made it a vital hub. Caravans laden with spices, perfumes, textiles, and precious metals passed through its markets, bringing wealth and a degree of cosmopolitanism to the city. Mecca also held a unique religious significance. It housed the Kaaba, a cubic structure venerated by various pagan tribes across the peninsula. Within its walls and surrounding it were idols representing a pantheon of deities, making Mecca a pilgrimage site and a neutral zone where tribal hostilities were temporarily suspended during sacred months. This religious centrality further cemented its economic importance, as pilgrims contributed to the city's commerce. The social fabric of Mecca was dominated by powerful merchant families, among whom the Quraysh tribe held preeminence. These families, through their control of trade and their guardianship of the Kaaba, wielded considerable influence not only within Mecca but across the peninsula. Their wealth was derived from shrewd business dealings, organizing and protecting caravans, and levying taxes on goods passing through their territory. Beneath this elite, a complex hierarchy existed, including smaller merchant families, artisans, and a significant population of slaves, often captured in raids or purchased from distant lands. The concept of *asabia*, or tribal solidarity, was paramount. One's identity, security, and standing were intrinsically linked to their tribe and clan. Loyalty to one's kin was an unquestioned virtue, and disputes between tribes often escalated into prolonged feuds, sometimes lasting for generations, fueled by a deep-seated sense of honor and the demand for retribution. Beyond the pagan traditions prevalent in Mecca and among the Bedouin, other religious currents flowed through Arabia. Jewish communities with a long history in the region were concentrated in oases like Yathrib, later Medina, and Yemen. They maintained synagogues, practiced their faith, and engaged in agriculture and trade. Christian communities, both Orthodox and Monophysite, also existed, particularly in the northern reaches bordering the Byzantine Empire and in the south, in Yemen, where the Ethiopian Aksumite kingdom had established a presence. These monotheistic faiths, with their sacred texts, prophets, and emphasis on a single all-powerful God, offered an alternative worldview to the polytheistic practices common in much of Arabia. They introduced concepts of divine judgment, the afterlife, and a moral code that transcended tribal loyalties. The Byzantine and Sasanian Persian empires, the two superpowers of the age, constantly vied for control over the lucrative trade routes and strategic territories bordering Arabia. While they did not directly govern the heart of the peninsula, their influence was palpable. They sponsored client states and tribal confederations on their respective frontiers, using them as buffers and proxies in their perennial conflicts. This geopolitical tension created a volatile environment, as Arabian tribes were often drawn into these larger power struggles, sometimes benefiting from imperial patronage, other times suffering from the instability. The constant wars between Byzantium and Persia also disrupted traditional trade routes, forcing merchants to seek alternative paths through Arabia, inadvertently increasing the peninsula's commercial significance. In this multifaceted world, where ancient traditions clashed with emerging urbanism and spiritual yearning coexisted with fierce tribalism, a societal shift was quietly underway. The old ways, while resilient, were showing cracks. The immense wealth generated by trade was creating new social stratifications, challenging the egalitarian ideals of some tribal structures. The emphasis on individual tribes, while providing security, often led to perpetual conflict and hindered broader unity. Monotheistic ideas, though not universally embraced, were circulating, offering a different framework for understanding the universe and humanity's place within it. It was into this crucible of tradition, commerce, conflict, and spiritual exploration that the man we are about to study was born. His life would become inextricably linked with this complex tapestry, and his message would ultimately reweave it into something entirely new. The Arabian Peninsula presented a landscape of profound contrasts, a vast expanse dominated by some of the most formidable natural features on Earth. Immense seas of sand stretching beyond the horizon gave way to jagged rocky plateaus and ancient volcanic fields, all baking under an unforgiving sun. This formidable interior was bordered by the Red Sea to the west, its waters a crucial artery for maritime trade, while to the east and south, the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea connected the peninsula to distant lands. To the north lay the fertile crescent of the Levant and Mesopotamia, ancient cradles of civilization which, though geographically distinct, were inextricably linked to Arabia. Far from being a remote backwater, Arabia in the 6th century was a vibrant nexus, a pivotal crossroads where trade routes from the Mediterranean world converged with those from Africa, Persia, India, and even further east. This unique geographical position ensured that Arabia was simultaneously a fiercely independent land, shaped by its own internal dynamics, and a deeply interconnected one, constantly interacting with the great empires and diverse cultures that surrounded it. In the absence of any centralized state or overarching legal framework, Arabian society was meticulously structured around the tribe or qabila, which served as the fundamental organizing principle of life. An individual's entire identity, their security, their legal standing, and their social value were entirely derived from their membership within a specific tribe and clan. This tribal loyalty, known as asabiya, was not merely a social construct, it was an absolute imperative, a bond that superseded all others. To violate this loyalty was to risk ostracization, an unthinkable fate in a harsh environment where collective survival was paramount. Blood feuds, ignited by perceived slights or acts of violence, could fester for generations, demanding an eye for an eye, a life for a life, until a complex system of arbitration or overwhelming force brought them to a temporary halt. Conversely, the sacred obligation of hospitality, extended even to strangers, was a cornerstone of tribal honor, offering protection and sustenance to those who sought it. Honor itself was an intangible currency, often valued above material wealth, and its defense could provoke fierce and deadly conflicts. These deeply ingrained concepts of tribalism and honor would prove central to understanding both the intense resistance Muhammad initially faced and the powerful alliances he would later forge. The religious tapestry of pre-Islamic Arabia was rich and multifaceted, a world that later Islamic tradition would label the Jahiliyyah often translated as the Age of Ignorance. This term, however, reflects a specific interpretive framework rather than a neutral historical description. Polytheism was the dominant religious practice, with the Arabian Peninsula home to a pantheon of hundreds of tribal deities. These gods and goddesses were often represented by physical idols, sacred stones, or natural phenomena, each tribe venerating its own specific patron deities. The Kaaba in Mecca, a cube-shaped structure, was already an ancient and profoundly revered sanctuary, housing a multitude of these tribal idols. This made Mecca a primary destination for pilgrims and a significant center for religious commerce, attracting tribes from across the peninsula. Beyond this widespread polytheism, vibrant Jewish communities thrived in urban centers like Yathrib, which would later become Medina, and in Khaybar, maintaining their synagogues and adhering to their monotheistic faith. Christian communities, both Eastern Orthodox and Monophysite, were also present, particularly in the northern regions bordering the Byzantine Empire and in the southern reaches of the peninsula, influenced by the Ethiopian Aksumite kingdom. Smaller groups, some influenced by Zoroastrianism from the Persian Empire, also dotted the landscape. This religious diversity was not a chaotic void, but rather a complex ecosystem of belief systems, each contributing to the spiritual landscape of the time. Mecca, the city into which Muhammad would be born, held a unique and pivotal position in 6th century Arabia. While not the largest or most politically powerful city on the peninsula, its significance was extraordinary, stemming from its dual role as a religious sanctuary and a commercial hub. At its heart stood the Kaaba, a cubic edifice that Muslim tradition identifies as having been originally built by the patriarch Abraham and his son Ishmael. This structure was the most sacred site in all of Arabia, drawing pilgrims from distant tribes during designated holy months, a time when tribal warfare was suspended, allowing for safe passage and commerce. This sacred status imbued Mecca with a kind of diplomatic neutrality, transforming it into a natural crossroads for trade caravans. The Quraysh tribe, Muhammad's own tribe, had astutely leveraged their control over Mecca and the Kaaba. They had cultivated a prosperous trading network, sending caravans laden with goods north to the markets of Syria and south to the fertile lands of Yemen. Being born into this specific city, at this particular historical juncture, within the heart of the Quraysh, would profoundly shape Muhammad's worldview, immersing him in both the spiritual traditions and the mercantile realities of his era. Beneath the veneer of prosperity enjoyed by Mecca's dominant Quraysh merchant class, pre-Islamic Meccan society was fraught with stark social inequalities and moral tensions. Slavery was a deeply entrenched and widely accepted institution, with enslaved individuals forming a significant portion of the labor force and possessing virtually no rights. Women, in many contexts, occupied a subordinate position, possessing limited legal standing and often treated as property, particularly in matters of marriage and inheritance. Practices such as female infanticide, though not universal, were known in certain parts of Arabia, reflecting a devaluing of female life. The poor, the orphaned, and the enslaved found themselves at the very bottom of a social hierarchy built almost entirely on blood ties, tribal power, and economic might, with little recourse for justice or protection. These conditions, however, are not recounted to simply condemn the society of the time, but rather to highlight their crucial significance. When Muhammad later emerged, preaching a radical message of equality before God, emphasizing accountability for the treatment of the vulnerable, and advocating for the abolition of certain exploitative practices, his words resonated deeply within a world where these problems were not abstract concepts, but visible, tangible, and profoundly felt realities. The stage was thus meticulously set for the arrival of the man who would ultimately challenge and transform this intricate tapestry of Arabian life. Before the emergence of Islam, the Arabian Peninsula was a mosaic of diverse cultures and social structures, bound together by trade routes and a shared, albeit fragmented, linguistic heritage. Mecca, in particular, stood as a crucial hub, not merely for commerce but also for religious pilgrimage. The Kaaba, a cubic structure at its heart, was already a revered sanctuary, housing idols representing various deities worshipped by different tribes. This polytheistic landscape, however, was not monolithic. Pockets of monotheism, particularly Jewish and Christian communities, existed across the peninsula, their presence adding another layer of complexity to the spiritual fabric of the region. These communities, often living in close proximity to pagan tribes, sometimes engaged in religious debates and discussions, subtly influencing the broader intellectual climate. The clash and confluence of these beliefs created a dynamic spiritual marketplace, where ideas about God, morality, and the afterlife were constantly being exchanged and reinterpreted. The tribal system was the bedrock of Arabian society, dictating allegiances, responsibilities, and conflicts. Blood kinship was paramount, forming the primary unit of social organization and providing individuals with their identity and protection. Loyalty to one's tribe often superseded all other considerations, leading to frequent intertribal skirmishes and protracted feuds, known as Days of Battle or Ayam al-Arab. These conflicts, often sparked by perceived insults, stolen livestock, or disputes over water rights, could escalate quickly and endure for generations, perpetuating cycles of revenge and retribution. The absence of a centralized authority meant that justice was often a matter of tribal strength and negotiation, with the strong often prevailing over the weak. This constant state of tension and warfare created a precarious existence for many, where security was always fleeting and survival often depended on the collective might of one's kin. Within this tribal framework, economic life was largely agrarian in the fertile areas, but nomadic pastoralism dominated much of the arid interior. The Bedouin, with their camels and sheep, traversed vast distances, following seasonal pastures and water sources. Their lives were characterized by self-reliance, resilience, and a deep understanding of the desert environment. Trade was another vital component of the economy, with caravans traversing the peninsula, connecting the markets of Yemen in the south with those of Syria and Mesopotamia in the north. Mecca, strategically located along these routes, flourished as a mercantile center. The Quraysh tribe, Muhammad's own tribe, held significant control over these trade networks, accumulating considerable wealth and influence. This economic power translated into social and political dominance, allowing them to dictate terms and exert authority over other, less prosperous tribes. Social stratification was stark and deeply entrenched. At the apex were the powerful tribal chiefs and wealthy merchants, who commanded respect and resources. Below them were the common tribesmen, whose status varied depending on their lineage and economic standing. At the very bottom of this hierarchy were the vulnerable, the orphans, the poor, and the enslaved. Orphans, having lost the protection of their parents and often their tribal affiliation, were particularly susceptible to exploitation and neglect. Their inheritance was frequently usurped, and their voices largely unheard. Poverty was widespread, with many struggling to secure even basic necessities, while the wealthy enjoyed lavish lifestyles, often at the expense of others. Slavery was a pervasive institution, with individuals bought and sold as commodities, their lives entirely at the mercy of their owners. These enslaved people, often captured during raids or purchased from distant lands, performed arduous labor, from agricultural tasks to domestic service, with no rights or prospects for freedom. The practice of female infanticide, particularly of daughters, though not universally practiced, was a grim reality in some quarters, reflecting a deeply rooted societal preference for male offspring and a devaluation of female life, often driven by economic anxieties or social stigma. The legal and ethical landscape was equally fragmented. There was no codified law in the modern sense. Instead, customs, traditions, and tribal arbitration governed disputes. The concept of honor was paramount, often dictating individual and tribal actions. An insult to one's honor, or the honor of one's tribe, could necessitate swift and often violent retaliation. While there were unwritten codes of conduct, such as hospitality to strangers and protection of guests, these were often overshadowed by the relentless pursuit of tribal interests and vendettas. The poor, the orphaned, and the enslaved found themselves at the very bottom of a social hierarchy, built almost entirely on blood ties, tribal power, and economic might, with little recourse for justice or protection. These conditions, however, are not recounted to simply condemn the society of the time, but rather to highlight their crucial significance. When Muhammad later emerged, preaching a radical message of equality before God, emphasizing accountability for the treatment of the vulnerable, and advocating for the abolition of certain exploitative practices, his words resonated deeply within a world where these problems were not abstract concepts, but visible, tangible, and profoundly felt realities. The stage was thus meticulously set for the arrival of the man who would ultimately challenge and transform this intricate tapestry of Arabian life. Muhammad entered the world around 570 CE, a year etched into Arabian memory as the Year of the Elephant, a time when an Abyssinian military expedition against Mecca reportedly met a miraculous defeat. He was born into the Banu Hashim clan, a branch of the powerful Quraysh tribe, a lineage respected for its heritage but not particularly distinguished by wealth within the bustling Meccan society. His father, Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, passed away either just before his birth or very soon after, a detail that varies slightly in traditional accounts but whose profound significance remains constant. Muhammad arrived already fatherless in a society meticulously structured around male lineage and paternal protection, where a man's identity and security were inextricably linked to his father. This early loss cast a long shadow, placing Muhammad in a position of inherent vulnerability from his very first breaths, in a world that valued strength and connection above all else. It was a common practice among Meccan families of standing to send their infants to be nursed and raised by Bedouin women in the desert. This custom was rooted in the belief that a child would not only grow up speaking a purer form of Arabic, but would also benefit from the healthier, unpolluted air and rugged conditions of rural life, far from the city's congestion. Thus, Muhammad too was placed in the care of Halima al-Sa'diyah, a woman belonging to the Banu Sa'd tribe. His earliest years unfolded amidst the vast, silent expanses of the desert, among the nomadic people whose lives were dictated by the rhythms of nature and the oral traditions passed down through generations. This pastoral upbringing profoundly shaped his early experiences, immersing him in the very essence of the Arabic language, a language that would later become the chosen medium for the divine revelations he would receive. Traditional narratives from this period often include stories of extraordinary signs witnessed by Halima, accounts which are presented here as reflections of the retrospective reverence early Muslim communities held for every stage of their prophet's life, rather than as literal historical fact. Then, when he was approximately 6 years old, another profound loss struck. His mother, Amina bint Wahab, took him on a journey to Medina, a visit ostensibly to see relatives and perhaps to show him his father's grave. On their return journey, at a place called Abwa, she too succumbed to illness and died. The emotional weight of this moment is almost unbearable to contemplate. A child, barely 6 years old, already bereft of a father, now witnessed the death of his mother on a desolate desert road. He was returned to Mecca under the care of a devoted servant woman named Baraka, affectionately known as Ayman, who would remain a steadfast and loyal presence throughout much of Muhammad's life. This repeated experience of orphanhood, of being utterly dependent on the kindness and generosity of others, of existing at the social margins in a society that prized strong family connections above all else, would leave an indelible mark on Muhammad's character. It is an experience that would later echo powerfully in the Quran's repeated and emphatic injunctions to care for orphans and the vulnerable. Following the death of his mother, Muhammad was taken into the care of his paternal grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib. This was a man of considerable standing and dignity in Mecca, one of its most respected elders, whose influence provided Muhammad with a measure of social protection and standing that his orphan status might otherwise have denied him. Abd al-Muttalib treated the boy with remarkable affection, often taking a special interest in him, seating him beside him at important tribal gatherings, and showing him an honor that sometimes surprised even his own sons. However, this period of relative security was also tragically brief. When Muhammad was approximately 8 years old, Abd al-Muttalib also passed away, delivering yet another devastating blow to the child's already fragile sense of belonging and security. This recurring pattern of loss, this childhood defined not by unwavering protection, but by repeated grief and the constant necessity of relying on the kindness of others, paints a vivid picture of the emotional landscape that shaped Muhammad's earliest years. With Abd al-Muttalib's death, Muhammad's guardianship passed to his uncle, Abu Talib. Abu Talib, though a respected merchant, was not a wealthy man, and with many children of his own, the addition of his orphan nephew meant that Muhammad grew up in conditions of relative scarcity rather than comfort. The young Muhammad contributed to the household, tending flocks in the hills surrounding Mecca and accompanying his uncle on trade journeys. One such journey, traditionally dated to when Muhammad was around 12 years old, led him north to Syria. It was during this expedition that Islamic tradition recounts an encounter with a Christian monk named Bahira, who supposedly recognized signs in the young boy indicating a future prophetic destiny. Regardless of its historical verifiability, this account powerfully reflects the early Muslim community's conviction that Muhammad's fate had been apparent even from his childhood. Thus, the early life of Muhammad unfolds as a narrative woven with threads of profound loss, sustained by enduring loyalty, and marked by a gradual movement into the wider world, preparing him for a destiny far grander than anyone could have imagined. The addition of his orphaned nephew meant that Muhammad grew up in conditions of relative scarcity rather than comfort. The young Muhammad contributed to the household, tending flocks in the hills surrounding Mecca and accompanying his uncle on trade journeys. One such journey, traditionally dated to when Muhammad was around 12 years old, led him north to Syria. It was during this expedition that Islamic tradition recounts an encounter with a Christian monk named Bahira, who supposedly recognized signs in the young boy indicating a future prophetic destiny, regardless of its historical verifiability. This account powerfully reflects the early Muslim community's conviction that Muhammad's fate had been apparent even from his childhood. Thus, the early life of Muhammad unfolds as a narrative woven with threads of profound loss, sustained by enduring loyalty, and marked by a gradual movement into the wider world, preparing him for a destiny far grander than anyone could have imagined. The economic realities of Mecca, a bustling trade hub, meant that even a relatively well-established clan like the Banu Hashem faced pressures. Abu Talib, inheriting the responsibility of feeding an additional mouth, worked diligently to maintain their standing. Muhammad's work as a shepherd, a common occupation for young boys in the region, offered him solitude and a deep connection to the natural world around Mecca. These solitary hours spent watching over flocks in the rugged, sun-baked hills might have provided a fertile ground for contemplation, a quiet space away from the clamour of the city's markets and the intricacies of tribal politics. The stark beauty of the desert landscape, the vastness of the sky, and the rhythms of nature would have been constant companions, fostering a sense of introspection that would later prove significant. The trade journeys, however, offered a different kind of education. Accompanying Abu Talib, Muhammad would have been exposed to the diverse cultures and beliefs that converged in the great trading cities of the Levant. He would have seen goods from distant lands, heard different languages, and observed the customs of various peoples. This direct exposure to the wider world, beyond the confines of Mecca's tribal society, was invaluable. It broadened his understanding of human society and the complex interplay of beliefs and practices. The caravans themselves were miniature, mobile societies, requiring discipline, cooperation, and resilience. Muhammad would have learned the practicalities of travel, the art of negotiation, and the importance of trust in commercial dealings. These experiences honed his character, instilling in him a sense of responsibility and an ability to navigate complex social situations, qualities that would be crucial for his later role as a leader and a prophet. The story of Bahira, while perhaps more illustrative than strictly historical, serves as a powerful narrative device within Islamic tradition. It suggests a divine foreknowledge, a preordained path for Muhammad that was discernible even in his youth. The monk, observing certain physical characteristics or perhaps an unusual aura around the young boy, is said to have recognized the seal of prophethood. This narrative element elevates Muhammad's early life from a simple biography to a testament of divine preparation. It reassures believers that Muhammad's mission was not merely a human endeavor, but a divinely guided destiny, foreshadowed and recognized by those with spiritual insight. The encounter also subtly connects the nascent Islamic tradition with earlier monotheistic faiths, particularly Christianity, by suggesting that their wise men possessed the foresight to recognize the coming prophet. This narrative bridge would later become significant in establishing Islam's continuity with, and culmination of, previous prophetic traditions. As Muhammad matured into young adulthood, his reputation for trustworthiness and integrity began to precede him. In a society where honor and reputation were paramount, his steadfast character earned him the honorific title Al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy. This was not merely a polite epithet, but a profound recognition of his moral fiber in a community that often grappled with internal disputes and the volatile nature of commercial dealings. His honesty in trade, his fairness in interactions, and his unwavering commitment to his word made him a respected figure, even among those who did not belong to his immediate clan. This widespread trust was a testament to the values instilled in him during his formative years, nurtured by Abu Talib's guidance and shaped by his own inherent moral compass. It underscored the importance of character in a pre-Islamic Arabian society that valued eloquence and bravery, but also recognized the profound utility of reliability. His reputation for integrity would later become a cornerstone of his appeal, drawing people to his message not just through its divine nature, but through the undeniable example of the messenger himself. This period of his life, characterized by diligence, integrity, and a growing reputation, laid the groundwork for the monumental responsibilities he would eventually undertake, solidifying his standing within the complex social fabric of Mecca and preparing him, both practically and ethically, for the profound transformation he was destined to bring about. Muhammad entered the bustling world of trade, the very heartbeat of the Quraysh tribe and the economic engine of Mecca. As a young man, without the benefit of inherited wealth or a prominent family business, his path into commerce was forged through service. He worked for others, accompanying caravans not as an owner, but as a hired hand, learning the intricate routes, the subtle art of negotiation, the customs of diverse peoples, and the delicate relationships that underpinned long-distance trade in the ancient world. A Meccan caravan journey was a spectacle of endurance and commerce. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of camels laden with precious goods, moving in a seemingly endless line across the vast desert. Under the unrelenting blaze of the noonday sun or the profound chill of the desert night, they traversed tribal territories where safe passage was never guaranteed, requiring either established alliances or careful diplomacy. These expeditions paused at vital oases and vibrant trading posts, where merchants from a multitude of cultures and backgrounds converged, not only to exchange silks, spices, and frankincense, but also to swap stories, ideas, and beliefs. These arduous journeys served as Muhammad's informal university, exposing him to a world far more expansive and varied than the familiar streets of Mecca. Through these years of diligent travel and honest dealings, Muhammad earned a reputation that echoed throughout Mecca, a title that became synonymous with his very name, Al-Amin, the trustworthy. In a commercial landscape where contracts were often sealed with a handshake, where a man's spoken word was his solemn bond, and where disputes were resolved more by tribal strength than by formal legal institutions, an unwavering reputation for absolute honesty was not merely a moral virtue, it was an invaluable practical asset. Al-Amin was not a title Muhammad bestowed upon himself. Rather, it was a spontaneous recognition from his community, a testament to a character trait consistently demonstrated over years of interactions. People sought him out to arbitrate their disagreements. Merchants entrusted him with their most valuable goods, and his word, once given, was understood to be unbreakable. This widespread trust meant that when Muhammad later began to articulate claims of receiving divine messages, those who knew him best were not encountering an unknown figure. They were engaging with a man whose integrity they had personally tested and trusted for decades. It was this sterling reputation that reached the ears of Khadija bint Khuwaylid, a woman of remarkable independence and commercial acumen in a society that generally constrained women's economic activities. Khadija was a wealthy widow and a shrewd businesswoman who managed her own extensive trading enterprise, hiring men to lead her caravans and overseeing her affairs with considerable skill. Impressed by tales of Muhammad's trustworthiness and competence, she hired him to lead one of her caravans to Syria. Muhammad's conduct on this journey was exemplary. He managed her goods with meticulous care, returned with significant profits, and left a profound impression on her servant, Maysara, who reportedly brought back glowing accounts of Muhammad's character and conduct. Khadija's subsequent decision to pursue a marriage with Muhammad was, by the standards of her era, an extraordinary act of personal agency. She was older than him, wealthier, and it was she who initiated the proposal. The marriage of Muhammad and Khadija took place when Muhammad was approximately 25 years old and Khadija was around 40, though some traditional sources offer slightly varying ages. This union marked a profound turning point in Muhammad's life. For the very first time, he found stability, a loving home, a devoted partner, financial security, and a family of his own. Khadija bore him several children, including daughters who would survive to adulthood, and at least 2 sons who tragically died in infancy. Their marriage was, by all accounts, a deeply loving and mutually respectful partnership. During Khadija's lifetime, Muhammad took no other wife, a detail that stands in stark contrast to his later marriages, and one that early Muslim sources consistently highlight to emphasize the profound depth of his bond with her. Khadija's wealth and social standing also provided Muhammad with a respected position within Meccan society that his orphan origins alone would never have afforded him, freeing him in many ways to cultivate the inner life that would eventually lead him to the cave on Mount Hira, A famous episode from Muhammad's life in his mid-30s vividly illustrates both his established reputation and his practical wisdom. The dispute over the replacement of the black stone in the Kaaba. When the Kaaba underwent renovations after being damaged by a flood, the question of which clan would be granted the immense honor of placing the sacred black stone back into its corner ignited a fierce rivalry. This dispute threatened to escalate into a violent tribal conflict as each clan asserted its right. In a moment of high tension, the competing clans collectively agreed to accept the judgment of the next man to walk through the gate of the sanctuary. That man, by destiny or chance, turned out to be Muhammad. His solution was remarkably elegant and averted bloodshed. He spread his cloak on the ground, carefully placed the black stone upon it, and then invited representatives from all the rival clans to simultaneously lift the corners of the cloak. In this way, the honor was shared equally among them. This story encapsulates the core qualities that defined Muhammad's pre-prophetic persona: his innate sense of fairness, his remarkable ability to devise solutions that respected and integrated competing interests, his calm demeanor under intense pressure, and his natural, undeniable authority. These qualities, honed through years of experience and trusted by his community, would prove indispensable in the monumental challenges that lay ahead. Baal conflict, as each clan asserted its right. In a moment of high tension, the competing clans collectively agreed to accept the judgment of the next man to walk through the gate of the sanctuary. That man, by destiny or chance, turned out to be Muhammad. His solution was remarkably elegant and averted bloodshed. He spread his cloak on the ground, carefully placed the black stone upon it, and then invited representatives from all the rival clans to simultaneously lift the corners of the cloak. In this way, the honor was shared equally among them. This story encapsulates the core qualities that defined Muhammad's pre-prophetic persona: his innate sense of fairness, his remarkable ability to devise solutions that respected and integrated competing interests, his calm demeanor under intense pressure, and his natural, undeniable authority. These qualities, honed through years of experience and trusted by his community, would prove indispensable in the monumental challenges that lay ahead. His early life, though marked by hardship and loss, was also a crucible that forged these virtues. Orphaned at a young age, first losing his father before birth and then his mother in early childhood, he was raised under the care of his grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, and subsequently his uncle, Abu Talib. This upbringing, far from the pampered existence of many of his peers, instilled in him a deep empathy for the vulnerable and a practical understanding of the struggles faced by ordinary people. He learned the value of hard work and self-reliance, virtues that would later define his leadership. He spent his youth tending flocks, a common occupation that offered ample time for contemplation and solitude, allowing him to observe the natural world and ponder the deeper mysteries of existence. This period of quiet reflection undoubtedly contributed to his profound spiritual sensitivity. As a young man, Muhammad ventured into trade, a profession that exposed him to diverse cultures and peoples beyond the confines of Mecca. He traveled with caravans, traversing the ancient trade routes that snaked through the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. These journeys were not merely commercial enterprises, they were educational experiences, broadening his horizons and sharpening his observational skills. He encountered different belief systems, customs, and forms of governance, gaining a nuanced understanding of the world that few of his contemporaries possessed. His reputation as an honest and trustworthy merchant, even among those with whom he traded, earned him the epithet Al-Amin, the trustworthy, a title universally recognized and respected throughout Mecca. This reputation was not easily earned in a society where commercial dealings could often be fraught with deceit and manipulation. His word was his bond, and his integrity was unassailable, making him a sought-after partner in business ventures. One such venture led him to Khadija bint Khuwailid, a wealthy and respected businesswoman who entrusted him with managing her trade caravans. Khadija, a woman of considerable intelligence and independence, was deeply impressed by Muhammad's character, his unwavering honesty, and his exceptional business acumen. Their professional relationship soon blossomed into a personal one, culminating in their marriage. This union was profoundly significant, providing Muhammad with not only a loving and supportive partner, but also a sense of stability and emotional solace that had been largely absent in his earlier life. Khadija became his closest confidante, his strongest advocate, and a source of unwavering encouragement, particularly in the challenging years that lay ahead. Her steadfast belief in him, even before his prophetic call, was a testament to the extraordinary qualities she recognized in her husband. Their marriage was a partnership of equals, a progressive model in an era where women often had limited agency. She was his rock, a constant presence of wisdom and reassurance. Beyond his personal life, Muhammad was deeply involved in the civic life of Mecca. He was known for his efforts to resolve disputes and mediate conflicts between warring tribes, often drawing upon his reputation for impartiality and his keen sense of justice. He was a member of the Hilf al-Fudul, an alliance formed to uphold justice and protect the rights of the oppressed, particularly those who were foreign or lacked tribal protection. This early commitment to social justice, long before his prophetic mission, demonstrates a consistent thread running through his life, a profound concern for the welfare of all people, regardless of their social standing or origin. He actively sought to rectify wrongs and alleviate suffering, embodying a compassionate leadership that transcended mere tribal loyalties. His participation in such initiatives showcased a moral compass that pointed steadfastly towards equity and compassion, setting him apart in a society often characterized by tribalism and self-interest. These were the formative years, the quiet preparation for a destiny that would reshape the world. Mecca in Muhammad's late 30s presented stark contradictions. Its bustling markets showcased prosperity, yet pilgrimage seasons often brought exploitation. The ancient Kaaba, a revered house of God, was surrounded by hundreds of idols offering little genuine spiritual solace. Meccan society grappled with brutal realities. Slaves were traded, the poor suffered, and tribal conflicts fractured unity. Muhammad was not alone in his spiritual unease. A small group, the Hanifs, had independently rejected polytheism, seeking a purer, monotheistic understanding of the divine. Early sources suggest Muhammad was either part of this tradition of spiritual seeking or deeply connected to it, though details remain a subject of historical discussion. It was during these years that Muhammad began a practice of profound personal retreat, seeking solace and clarity in Cave Hira. This small grotto was situated on Jabal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light, a rocky peak rising a short distance from Mecca. Regularly, especially during Ramadan, Muhammad would withdraw from urban life, taking provisions for days, sometimes weeks, alone in the cave. He dedicated himself to prayer, fasting, and intense contemplation. One can visualize this secluded sanctuary, a narrow opening leading into a space barely large enough for a person to sit or lie down comfortably. From its vantage point, one could gaze down upon Mecca, a miniature world far below, while the vast desert stretched to the horizon. At night, the sky blazed with stars. In a world defined by social obligations, tribal politics, and ceaseless commerce, Muhammad deliberately carved out a space for silence, for profound inwardness. He created an environment conducive to sustained reflection, which his busy life rarely permitted. While such retreats were not uncommon among spiritual seekers, Muhammad's intensity and regularity suggest a man genuinely wrestling with fundamental questions that his world, with its material pursuits and superficial answers, simply could not address. During these extended periods of solitude, specific questions undoubtedly preoccupied Muhammad's mind, questions that resonate through early Islamic sources and the historical context of his era. What was the true nature of the divine? Were the hundreds of idols within the Kaaba genuinely effective intermediaries between humanity and a higher power, or were they, as the Hanif suspected, merely empty creations of human hands, devoid of real spiritual efficacy? What awaited human beings after death? Was there a justice beyond the grave, a final reckoning for those who had suffered injustice and exploitation in this life? Furthermore, what were the true obligations of a person of conscience in a society so deeply stratified, so often built upon exploitation and inequality? It is important not to present these as Muhammad's definitive thoughts, but rather as the kinds of profound inquiries that the historical and spiritual climate of his life made almost inevitable. He was in essence like any thoughtful person in any era, confronted by the pervasive suffering and injustice of the world, asking whether the universe possessed a moral order and whether human life held a purpose beyond the mere accumulation of wealth and power. Throughout this period of intense spiritual searching, Khadija played an invaluable role in supporting Muhammad. Far from dismissing his retreats as eccentric or a cause for worry, she appears to have understood and profoundly supported his need for solitude and contemplation. She ensured he had sufficient provisions for his journeys to Cave Hira, accepted his prolonged absences without complaint, and engaged with him seriously and thoughtfully upon his return. This speaks volumes about their relationship. Muhammad's profound spiritual journey was not undertaken in isolation from human love and connection, but was in fact sustained and nurtured by it. Khadija's unwavering faith in her husband, her willingness to take his inner life seriously, would prove to be one of the most crucial factors in the extraordinary story that was about to unfold. It is also worth considering that Khadija herself possessed a discerning religious sensibility. She was not a casual observer of Meccan polytheism, but rather a thoughtful and spiritually inclined person. This shared inclination likely contributed to the atmosphere of seriousness and inquiry that characterized their household, fostering an environment where deep spiritual questions could be openly explored. As the time for revelation drew nearer, the intensity of Muhammad's spiritual experiences grew. Early Islamic sources describe him experiencing increasingly vivid dreams that often seemed to come true, a phenomenon that Muslim tradition regards as one of the early signs of prophethood. This period immediately preceding the first revelation is characterized in traditional sources as one of heightened spiritual sensitivity and, simultaneously, an escalating sense of unease. There was a pervasive feeling that something momentous was approaching, that the world was pregnant with a profound meaning yet to be unveiled, and that the silence of his cave retreats was not empty but rather filled with an unseen presence, something he could not yet name or fully comprehend. This description serves not to assert supernatural claims, but to convey the psychological and spiritual state of a man poised on the very precipice of a transformative experience, whatever its ultimate nature. It was with this profound sense of anticipation, this internal stirring of destiny, that Muhammad began his ascent up the mountain of light towards Cave Hira on a night that would irrevocably alter the course of human history. The air on Jabal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light, was often cool and still, a stark contrast to Mecca's bustling energy below. As Muhammad ascended, the city lights would have twinkled like scattered jewels, a world he was both deeply a part of and increasingly detached from. Each step up the rugged incline was an act of deliberate intention, a physical manifestation of his inner quest. He was seeking solitude, yes, but more profoundly, he was seeking clarity, a truth that felt just beyond his grasp. The cave itself, Hira, was modest, a small opening in the rock face, barely large enough for a man to sit comfortably. It offered a panoramic view of the desert landscape, stretching out under the vast star-strewn Arabian sky. This was his sanctuary, a place where the mundane concerns of trade and tribal politics faded. Allowing his mind to wander into deeper contemplation, he would spend days, sometimes weeks, in this secluded spot, subsisting on meager provisions, lost in thought and prayer, his gaze often fixed on the horizon, as if expecting an answer to emerge from the silent expanse. On this particular night, the solitude of Hira was about to be profoundly broken. It was the month of Ramadan, a time traditionally associated with spiritual intensity. As he sat in his customary posture, perhaps meditating or simply gazing into the darkness, a presence materialized. The accounts describe it as a figure or an angel named Jibril or Gabriel. This was not a gentle, ethereal visitation. The initial encounter was described as overwhelming, almost violent in its intensity. The angel commanded him, "Iqra," which means recite or read. Muhammad, who was unlettered, responded in genuine bewilderment. "I cannot read." The command was repeated, with increasing force, until the angel embraced him, squeezing him so tightly that he felt as though he would suffocate. This physical distress, this visceral impact, underscores the extraordinary nature of the event. It was not a dream, nor a gentle whisper, but a profound physical and spiritual shock that shook him to his core. With the third command, Iqra, the words began to flow, not from his own mind, but through him. They were the opening verses of what would eventually become the Quran. "Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging clot. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not." These words, profound in their simplicity and cosmic in their scope, spoke of creation, of humanity's humble origins, and of the divine act of teaching, of imparting knowledge. For Muhammad, a man deeply concerned with the moral decay and spiritual emptiness he observed in his society, these verses were not merely abstract pronouncements. They were a direct, undeniable message, a calling to a purpose far greater than anything he could have imagined. The experience left him trembling, his heart pounding, a mixture of awe and terror washing over him. He had sought truth in the silence of the cave, and truth had found him, not as a gentle revelation, but as an earthquake of the soul. He fled the cave, descending the mountain in a state of profound shock and confusion. He was not a man who sought power or public attention. His life until then had been one of quiet integrity and contemplation. This sudden, inexplicable encounter left him questioning his sanity, fearing he had been touched by a jinn, a malevolent spirit, or that he was losing his mind. The physical manifestations of the experience, the trembling, the cold sweat, the intense fear, were real and undeniable. He rushed home to his wife, Khadija, seeking solace and understanding. He recounted the terrifying encounter, describing the angel, the forceful command, and the words that had been imprinted upon his heart. Khadija, a woman of immense wisdom and unwavering loyalty, listened patiently. Her response was crucial. She did not dismiss his experience as a delusion or a nightmare. Instead, she offered immediate and profound reassurance. She reminded him of his character, his honesty, his kindness to the poor and the weak, his upholding of family ties. "By God," she declared, "God will never disgrace you. You keep good relations with your relatives. You speak the truth. You bear the burden of the helpless. You help the poor and the needy. You entertain guests, and you help the deserving calamity-afflicted ones." This affirmation from Khadija was not merely comforting, it was foundational. It validated his experience, placing it within the context of his virtuous life. She then sought the counsel of her cousin, Waraka ibn Naufal, a venerable old man who was a Christian scholar and familiar with ancient scriptures. Waraka, upon hearing Muhammad's account, immediately recognized the significance of the event. He declared that this was the same angel Gabriel who had appeared to Moses. He understood that Muhammad had been chosen as a prophet, predicting that his people would reject him and drive him out. This confirmation from an external learned source, particularly one steeped in monotheistic traditions, further solidified the reality of Muhammad's experience. It moved it beyond personal terror and into the realm of divine calling. The initial shock began to give way to a dawning understanding of the immense responsibility that had been placed upon his shoulders. He was no longer just Muhammad, the honest trader, the contemplative seeker. He was now the recipient of divine revelation, a messenger. The journey had just begun, and the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But the seed of a new faith had been sown in the heart of a man in a cave on a mountain, overlooking a city still steeped in polytheism. It was the month of Ramadan, a time when the desert air cooled slightly after the relentless heat of the day, and the nights in the year 610 CE stretched long and silent. Muhammad, then approximately 40 years old, found himself, as he had many times before, alone in the quiet solitude of Cave Hira. Below, the city of Mecca lay hushed, its flickering fires and distant sounds muted by the mountain's height, while above, the stars blazed with an intensity only seen in the clearest desert skies. He was engaged in his customary prayer and deep contemplation, a middle-aged man seeking solace and meaning in the familiar ritual of solitude. There was no outward sign, no whisper in the wind, to suggest that this night would diverge from any other he had spent in quiet reflection. Suddenly, according to Islamic tradition, a powerful presence manifested itself, later identified by Muslim sources as the angel Jibril, known in the Western tradition as Gabriel. This imposing figure commanded Muhammad with an overwhelming force to Iqra, which means read or recite. Muhammad, who according to tradition was not literate in the conventional sense, replied that he did not know how to read. The command came again, even more forcefully, and again Muhammad, overwhelmed by the presence, could only repeat his inability to read. On the third command, according to Islamic tradition, the words flowed from him, not of his own volition, but as if inscribed upon his very being, forming the opening verses of what would become the Quran's 96th chapter, Surah Al-Alaq. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. Muhammad's immediate reaction was one of profound terror. His body trembled uncontrollably, and he felt as though he had been physically seized and squeezed with immense power. He fled from the cave, stumbling down the mountainside, gripped by a fear that he was losing his mind, or had been possessed by a malevolent jinn, the supernatural beings that Arabian culture associated with both madness and poetic inspiration. This was not the calm acceptance of a man ready to declare himself a prophet. nor the calculated response of someone orchestrating a religious movement. His terror, the profound self-doubt, and the desperate flight from the mountain all speak to an experience that felt utterly real and overwhelmingly powerful to the man who endured it. He rushed home to Khadija shaking uncontrollably, crying out the famous command, "Samiluni," meaning "cover me, wrap me up." He recounted the terrifying encounter, the powerful presence, the command to read, and the words that had poured from him. Khadija's response in that moment is recorded as one of the most remarkable and pivotal in the entire narrative of Islam's origins. She did not dismiss his experience as a mere dream or a hallucination. Instead, with unwavering conviction, she reassured him with words preserved in early Islamic sources, stating that God would never humiliate him. She grounded her faith in his character, reminding him that he was kind to his relatives, helped the poor, was generous to guests, and assisted those afflicted by misfortune. Her immediate instinct was not to question the supernatural event itself, but to attest to his moral integrity, arguing that a man of such ethical standing could not be the target of malevolent forces or delusion. To further understand the gravity of the situation, Khadija took Muhammad to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nafal, an elderly Christian scholar. Waraka had devoted his life to studying the Hebrew scriptures and Christian gospels and was highly respected for his religious learning. Upon hearing Muhammad's account of the encounter in the cave, Waraka's response was immediate and profound. He declared that the presence Muhammad described was none other than the same divine messenger, Jibreel, who had appeared to Moses. He unequivocally stated that Muhammad was the prophet of his people. However, Waraka also delivered a solemn warning that would foreshadow the immense challenges to come. He told Muhammad that his people would inevitably drive him out, that he would face intense hostility and persecution, and expressed a wish that he were younger to live to see those difficult days. Waraka's recognition provided a crucial external validation, placing Muhammad's experience within a familiar pattern of divine revelation known to those with religious knowledge. Yet, this recognition was intertwined with the sobering reality that such a calling would not shield him from the fierce opposition of those whose established interests and beliefs his message would inevitably threaten. Guy Muhammad's account of the encounter in the cave, Waraka's response was immediate and profound. He declared that the presence Muhammad described was none other than the same divine messenger Jibril who had appeared to Moses. He unequivocally stated that Muhammad was the prophet of his people. However, Waraka also delivered a solemn warning that would foreshadow the immense challenges to come. He told Muhammad that his people would inevitably drive him out, that he would face intense hostility and persecution, and expressed a wish that he were younger to live to see those difficult days. Waraka's recognition provided a crucial external validation, placing Muhammad's experience within a familiar pattern of divine revelation known to those with religious knowledge. Yet, this recognition was intertwined with the sobering reality that such a calling would not shield him from the fierce opposition of those whose established interests and beliefs his message would inevitably threaten. The initial encounter in the cave and Waraka's subsequent affirmation plunged Muhammad into a period of deep introspection and a profound shift in his perception of the world. The visions and messages did not cease. Rather, they continued in a sporadic but insistent rhythm, often arriving at unexpected moments, demanding his full attention. These early revelations were not grand pronouncements of law or detailed theological treatises, but rather short, powerful verses that spoke to the nature of God, the impending day of judgment, and the moral responsibilities of humanity. They emphasized the oneness of God, a stark contrast to the polytheistic practices prevalent in Mecca, and called for social justice, compassion for the poor, and an end to infanticide, particularly of female infants, a practice tragically common at the time. One of the most striking aspects of these early verses was their poetic beauty and rhythmic cadence, which captivated those who heard them. They possessed an undeniable power, a linguistic miracle that even the most eloquent poets of Mecca, renowned for their mastery of the Arabic language, found themselves unable to replicate or refute. This artistic and spiritual resonance became a key element in attracting early converts, drawing them not just through logical argument, but through an emotional and aesthetic appeal that touched the depths of their being. The messages were often direct and uncompromising, challenging the established norms and the very foundations of Meccan society, which was deeply entrenched in idol worship and a hierarchical social structure that favored the wealthy and powerful. For a time, Muhammad kept these experiences largely to himself and his closest confidants. His wife, Khadija, was his first and most steadfast supporter, offering solace and unwavering belief during moments of doubt and apprehension. Her unwavering faith provided a crucial anchor in a sea of uncertainty, reassuring him that his experiences were not delusions but genuine divine encounters. Following Khadija, his young cousin Ali, who lived in his household, and his freed slave Zayd ibn Haritha were among the very first to embrace the new message. They saw in Muhammad not just a trusted leader, but someone transformed by an undeniable spiritual power. Someone speaking with an authority that transcended human origin. The conversion of Abu Bakr, a respected merchant and close friend of Muhammad, marked a significant turning point in the nascent Muslim community. Abu Bakr's reputation for integrity and wisdom lent considerable weight to the new message. His acceptance signaled that this was not merely a personal spiritual journey, but a movement with broader implications, capable of attracting individuals of standing and influence within Mayfan society. Abu Bakr, in turn, became a tireless advocate, bringing others into the fold, often discreetly at first, as the implications of openly declaring belief in one God and rejecting the ancestral deities were fraught with danger. The initial phase of propagation was largely clandestine, a quiet whisper of truth spreading among a select few. Meetings were held in secret, often in the homes of early converts, to avoid the watchful eyes of the Meccan elite. The message, though universal in its scope, had to navigate a treacherous landscape of entrenched traditions, economic interests tied to idol worship, and a deep-seated resistance to change. The Kaaba, the central shrine in Mecca, was filled with idols, and its upkeep, along with the pilgrimage trade, formed the economic backbone of the city. Any challenge to this system was not merely a theological dispute, it was a direct threat to the power structures and economic prosperity of the Quraysh, the ruling tribe of Mecca. As the number of believers slowly grew, the need for a more public declaration became apparent. The divine command to proclaim what you have been commanded, Quran 15:94, eventually arrived, signaling an end to the period of secret worship and marking the beginning of open evangelism. This transition was momentous, a deliberate step into the arena of public discourse and potential confrontation. Muhammad began to preach openly, first to his own clan, the Banu Hashim, and then to the wider Meccan populace. He would stand at the Kaaba, the very heart of Meccan polytheism, and recite the verses of the Quran, calling people to abandon their idols and worship the one true God. This public declaration was met with a mixture of curiosity, ridicule, and increasingly outright hostility. The leaders of the Quraysh, initially dismissive, soon realized that Muhammad's message was gaining traction, threatening their authority and the very fabric of their society. The stage was set for a long and arduous struggle, a confrontation between the established order and a revolutionary new faith. The peaceful days of private contemplation were over, replaced by the clangor of public debate and the growing shadow of persecution. A profound silence descended after the overwhelming intensity of the first revelation in Cave Hira, a period known in Islamic tradition as the Fatra, or the interruption in divine communication, following that initial terrifying encounter where Muhammad had been commanded to read by the angelic presence. And after Waraka's confirmation that he was a prophet, no further messages arrived. This silence, stretching from a few months to even 3 years according to some historical accounts, must have been profoundly disorienting for Muhammad. He had experienced something utterly transformative, a direct encounter with the divine, followed by an authoritative pronouncement of his prophetic calling, and then nothing. Early Islamic sources paint a picture of deep anxiety and uncertainty during this interval, with Muhammad questioning whether the experience had been a singular event, whether he had been abandoned by the divine, or if he had in some way proven unworthy or failed in his nascent mission. Some narratives, which are presented with an awareness of their interpretive nature and historical distance, even speak of Muhammad becoming so distressed that he contemplated self-harm, considering throwing himself from a mountain, only to be stayed by a voice that called out to him. This period of silence, the Fatra, offers a crucial lens through which to explore the psychological dimensions of Muhammad's experience. Historians and psychologists approaching Muhammad's life from various perspectives have proposed frameworks ranging from theories of epilepsy or profound mystical states to intense psychological crises, all attempting to understand the nature of these experiences. In contrast, Muslim scholars have consistently interpreted the Fatra as a divinely orchestrated period of preparation and testing, a crucible designed to strengthen the prophet and deepen his reliance on God. Regardless of the interpretive lens applied, the existence of the Fatra itself is profoundly significant. It underscores that the revelatory experience was not something Muhammad controlled or could summon at will. It was an external force acting upon him. The documented uncertainty and suffering he endured during this time were real, not later embellishments, demonstrating a human being genuinely grappling with phenomena beyond his immediate comprehension. This interval deepens our understanding of Muhammad not as an unfeeling vessel, but as a man deeply affected by his extraordinary calling. The period of profound distress eventually broke with the resumption of revelation, marked by a second major divine communication, which Islamic tradition identifies as the opening verses of Surah ad-Duha, the chapter of the morning light. Traditional accounts describe Muhammad as being in a state of deep anxiety when this revelation arrived, and its content directly addressed his inner turmoil. The verses, profound in their reassurance, declare, "By the morning brightness, and by the night when it is still, your Lord has not forsaken you, nor has he detested you." This communication, as understood within Islamic tradition, possesses a remarkable intimacy. The divine voice directly acknowledged and responded to Muhammad's specific fear of abandonment, offering a direct, comforting reassurance. Whether one interprets this as a genuine supernatural communication or as a powerful psychological resolution to an intense inner crisis, the content of these verses strikingly reflects the emotional state that historical sources attribute to Muhammad during the preceding Fatra. With the advent of Surah ad-Duha, revelations began to resume, not in a continuous torrent but gradually, marking the beginning of Muhammad's emerging sense of mission. As these further communications arrived, Muhammad began to share them, initially with Khadija, who remained his steadfast confidant, and then with a small, trusted circle of individuals. This earliest phase of the prophetic mission was characterized by an intimate, almost secretive quality. There were no public proclamations, no direct confrontations with the established Meccan elite, and no organized movement in the modern sense. It was simply a man sharing with his closest relationships, a series of experiences he understood as divine communications, and a small group of people who found these messages compelling enough to accept them as genuine. This initial period illustrates that the genesis of Islam was not a dramatic public announcement, but rather a series of quiet personal conversations occurring in the privacy of homes, in quiet garden spaces, and along the desert paths surrounding Mecca. The content of these early revelations themselves offers a crucial insight, revealing themes that would remain central to the entire Quranic message. The early surahs or chapters are typically short, intensely poetic, and focus on a limited number of powerful foundational concepts. These include the absolute oneness of God, the undeniable reality of divine judgment, the moral obligations of human beings, particularly towards the vulnerable and the impoverished, the ephemeral nature of worldly wealth and power, and the certainty of accountability in the afterlife. These themes were not abstract theological propositions, but direct challenges to the prevailing values and practices of Meccan society. Anyone who heard these messages and took them seriously would have immediately understood that accepting this new faith demanded a fundamental reorientation of their relationship to money, to power, to existing social hierarchies, and ultimately to the divine. This understanding sets the stage for the next chapter, as it explores the formation and initial experiences of this nascent community of believers. The early believers, drawn from various strata of Meccan society, found themselves in a precarious position. Their acceptance of Muhammad's message, which declared the traditional idols to be powerless fabrications and asserted a singular, transcendent God, directly threatened the economic and social fabric of Mecca. The city's prosperity was inextricably linked to the annual pilgrimages to the Kaaba, a sanctuary housing numerous idols, each representing a deity revered by different tribes. To challenge these idols was to challenge the very foundation of Meccan commerce and tribal identity. Consequently, the initial converts faced ostracization, ridicule, and increasingly, overt persecution. This was not a gradual erosion of social standing, but often an immediate and stark rupture. Families disowned their kin, business partnerships dissolved, and individuals found themselves shunned in the bustling marketplace that had once been their livelihood. Consider the example of Bilal ibn Rabah, an Abyssinian slave. His conversion was met with brutal torture by his master, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, who would lay him on the scorching desert sand under the midday sun, placing a heavy rock on his chest, demanding he renounce his new faith. Yet Bilal's unwavering response, "Ahad, Ahad, one, one," echoed his profound conviction in the singular God. This steadfastness under duress was not unique. It became a hallmark of the early community. Another prominent figure, Khabab ibn al-Arat, a blacksmith, endured similar torment. His back bore the scars of being pressed against burning coals, yet he too refused to recant. These stories, passed down through generations, illustrate the immense personal cost of conversion and the extraordinary resilience forged in the crucible of early persecution. The emerging community, though small, was remarkably diverse. It included not only slaves and the impoverished, who perhaps had little to lose and much to gain from a message emphasizing equality and justice, but also influential figures from powerful Meccan clans. Abu Bakr, a wealthy merchant and respected elder, was among the very first to embrace Islam, lending significant credibility and financial support to the nascent movement. Uthman ibn Affan, another prosperous merchant, and Umar ibn al-Khattab, initially a fierce opponent who later converted and became a pivotal leader, further exemplify this diversity. Their conversions were particularly impactful, demonstrating that the message resonated across social divides and was not merely a refuge for the disenfranchised. These individuals, despite their differing backgrounds, were united by a shared faith and a profound sense of camaraderie, recognizing each other as brothers and sisters in a new transformative social order. This nascent community did not merely coalesce around shared beliefs, it actively practiced a new way of life. The early Quranic revelations continually emphasized mutual support, generosity, and social justice. Believers were enjoined to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and care for orphans and widows. The concept of zakat, a mandatory charitable giving, began to take shape, fostering a sense of collective responsibility for the welfare of all members. This practical expression of faith stood in stark contrast to the prevailing Meccan ethos, which often glorified individual wealth accumulation and tribal superiority. The early Muslims, therefore, were not just adherents of a new religion, they were participants in a social experiment, building a community founded on principles of equity, compassion, and shared destiny. Their gatherings, initially clandestine and held in secret locations like the house of Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam, served not only for prayer and learning, but also as vital spaces for mutual encouragement, strategizing, and strengthening their collective resolve in the face of escalating hostility. These gatherings were crucial for the psychological and spiritual sustenance of a community under siege, allowing them to reinforce their shared identity and purpose. The very first person to accept Muhammad's prophetic claim was his own wife, Khadijah. This fact carries immense significance, for she knew him most intimately, having observed his virtues and flaws over many years. Khadijah's acceptance was an act of profound personal trust, built on decades of direct knowledge. She had witnessed him in moments of weakness and uncertainty, just as she had seen his strength and wisdom. Her faith, therefore, was not that of someone dazzled by a charismatic stranger, but the considered judgment of a woman who had tested his character and found it worthy of belief. Her role in the early years of Islam extended far beyond this symbolic first conversion. She was Muhammad's emotional anchor, his financial supporter, and his most consistent source of encouragement during the difficult years that lay ahead. Among the very first male believers was Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's young cousin living in his household. Ali was a child or young teenager at the time of his conversion, illustrating the deep family dimension of the early Muslim community. Another pivotal early convert was Abu Bakr, a wealthy and respected Meccan merchant, and one of Muhammad's closest friends. His acceptance was significant for a different reason. Abu Bakr was a man of social standing and commercial connections, and his belief bestowed upon the nascent movement a degree of social credibility it might otherwise have lacked. Abu Bakr approached the task of spreading the message quietly and personally, utilizing his extensive network of friends and business associates. Indeed, several of the earliest converts came to Islam through his personal persuasion. These individual stories highlight that the early Muslim community was not a uniform mass, but a diverse collection of individuals from different backgrounds and social positions, each finding Muhammad's message uniquely compelling. The conversion of Zayd ibn Haritha further illustrates one of the most radical implications of Muhammad's early message. Zayd was a freed slave who had been given to Khadijah and then to Muhammad. When his biological family eventually came to reclaim him, Zayd famously chose to remain with Muhammad, freely declaring his allegiance. This act underscored the revolutionary declaration that human beings were equal before God, regardless of their social status. In a society where a freed slave remained socially inferior to even the poorest free person, the idea that God judged human beings by their piety rather than their lineage was genuinely transformative. Another powerful example is Bilal ibn Rabah, an enslaved man of African origin. He would later become one of the most beloved figures in early Islamic history, eventually becoming the first muezzin, the caller to prayer. Bilal's story, which would unfold with remarkable resilience in the face of brutal persecution, stands as one of the most poignant illustrations of how Muhammad's message directly challenged the entrenched social hierarchies of his world. Drawing on the lists of early converts preserved in Islamic historical sources, the social profile of the early Muslim community reveals a remarkably diverse group. It included wealthy merchants and enslaved people, men and women, the young and the old, members of the powerful Quraysh tribe, and individuals from other, less influential tribes. What united them was not a common social position, but a common response to Muhammad's message, a profound sense that it addressed something real about the world and about their own inner lives. The very diversity of this early community was, in itself, a kind of argument for the message's authenticity, at least in the eyes of those who accepted it. A movement that appealed simultaneously to a wealthy widow, a young boy, a freed slave, and a respected merchant was clearly not simply a vehicle for any one group's social interests. This broad appeal helps us understand why the movement, despite facing formidable obstacles, continued to grow. The early practice of the Muslim community revolved around prayer, the recitation of Quranic verses, and gatherings in private homes. A profound sense of shared identity began to develop among people who had previously been connected only by tribal and commercial ties. A young Muslim named Al-Arqam offered his home, the House of Al-Arqam, as a gathering place for this nascent community. The atmosphere of these early meetings was intimate and somewhat secretive, characterized by a mixture of spiritual intensity and a very practical concern about the growing hostility of Meccan society. Islam in its earliest years was not a powerful institution, but a small, vulnerable community of individuals, bound together by a shared conviction and a shared risk. They met in borrowed spaces, speaking carefully about their beliefs in a city that was rapidly beginning to regard them with suspicion. This close-knit environment fostered an intense spiritual development among the early believers. They weren't just learning new doctrines, they were living them, often in defiance of established social norms. The Quranic revelations, delivered piecemeal, served as both spiritual guidance and a practical manual for navigating their increasingly complex situation. These verses addressed everything from the nature of God and the afterlife to ethical conduct, social justice, and the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity. Each new revelation was eagerly received, memorized, and discussed, forming the bedrock of their collective understanding and reinforcing their commitment. The act of communal prayer, performed together in those hidden spaces, became a powerful ritual of solidarity, a visible and audible expression of their unity in a world that sought to divide them. It was a deliberate break from the polytheistic practices prevalent in Mecca, a declaration of allegiance to a singular, unseen God, performed with an earnestness born of conviction. The early converts came from diverse backgrounds, reflecting the universal appeal of the message. While some were from the Prophet's own clan, the Banu Hashim, others were individuals from less prominent families, and even some who were enslaved. This inclusivity was radical for Meccan society, which was rigidly structured by lineage and social standing. The message of Islam proclaimed an equality before God that transcended these earthly distinctions, offering hope and dignity to those who were marginalized. Bilal ibn Rabah, an enslaved Abyssinian, became one of the most prominent and respected early Muslims. His strong voice calling the faithful to prayer, his story, and the stories of others like him, illustrated the transformative power of the new faith, demonstrating that spiritual worth was not dictated by tribal affiliation or economic status. This egalitarian ethos was a direct challenge to the Meccan aristocracy, whose power was intrinsically linked to their established social hierarchy and ancestral prestige. The growing number of adherents, even in secret, did not go unnoticed. Meccan leaders, initially dismissive, began to perceive the new movement as a genuine threat to their economic and religious hegemony. The Kaaba, a central shrine housing numerous idols, was the focal point of Meccan trade and pilgrimage. attracting visitors and revenue from across the Arabian Peninsula. The Prophet Muhammad's monotheistic message directly challenged the legitimacy of these idols, and by extension the authority of those who profited from their worship. The economic implications were immense, threatening to disrupt the very fabric of Meccan prosperity. Beyond economics, there was a deeply ingrained fear of social upheaval. The traditional tribal system, with its intricate web of alliances and retaliations, was the bedrock of their society. Islam, by calling for a brotherhood of believers that superseded tribal loyalties, was seen as undermining this fundamental order, potentially leading to anarchy and the collapse of their way of life. Thus, the initial dismissiveness gave way to active opposition. The Meccan elite, led by figures like Abu Jahl and Abu Sufyan, began to employ various tactics to suppress the burgeoning community. These ranged from ridicule and verbal abuse to economic boycotts and physical persecution. The early Muslims, particularly those without strong tribal protection, faced immense pressure. They were often subjected to public humiliation, denied access to trade, and in some cases tortured. Stories abound of the resilience of these early believers, like Sumaya, who is considered the first martyr in Islam, refusing to recant her faith even under extreme duress. Her unwavering commitment, and that of others who suffered similar fates, served as a powerful testament to the depth of their conviction and the profound impact of the Prophet's message. These acts of persecution, rather than stamping out the movement, often had the unintended effect of strengthening the resolve of the believers and drawing more attention to their cause, inadvertently fueling the very growth the Meccans sought to prevent. The shared suffering forged an even deeper bond among the community members, solidifying their identity as a distinct and resilient group against an increasingly hostile world. The moment arrived when Muhammad received a direct divine instruction to cease his private counsel and instead proclaim his message openly, marking a decisive escalation in his mission. He began with those closest to him, gathering his extended family, the Banu Hashim, on the slopes of Mount Safa, a prominent hill overlooking Mecca. As the assembled members of the Quraysh clan gathered, Muhammad called out to them, asking whether they would believe him if he warned them that an army was about to attack from behind the mountain. They all assented, acknowledging his lifelong reputation for truthfulness, his title of Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Then, with their trust acknowledged, he delivered his profound message. He was a warner, sent to them by the one true God, and they must abandon their many idols and submit to this singular divine authority. The reaction was swift and sharp. His own uncle, Abu Lahab, reportedly dismissed the gathering angrily, declaring, "Perish you! Is this why you gathered us?" This confrontation, though seemingly small in scale, established the pattern of resistance Muhammad would face for the next decade. His appeal to his unimpeachable honesty met with rejection by those whose established social and economic interests were directly threatened by his revolutionary message. The Meccan establishment's opposition to Muhammad's message extended far beyond mere theological conservatism or attachment to ancestral idols. It was a rational defense of a deeply entrenched social and economic order. The Quraysh derived immense power and prosperity from their control of the Kaaba, which, as a sanctuary for hundreds of tribal deities, served as the focal point of a lucrative pilgrimage economy. If the idols were removed and the Kaaba dedicated to a single, unseen god, the entire system of tribal pilgrimage, which brought both wealth and unparalleled influence to Mecca, would be irrevocably disrupted. Furthermore, Muhammad's radical message of equality before God, declaring that a slave was spiritually equal to a master, was a direct and existential challenge to the rigid, hierarchical social structure that maintained the dominance of the wealthy and powerful Meccan elite. To accept such a doctrine would be to dismantle the very foundations of their societal privilege. Perhaps even more profoundly, the declaration that the ancestors of the Quraysh, revered figures in their lineage, were destined for hell because they had died as polytheists, was an unbearable insult to tribal honor and ancestral pride, striking at the very core of their identity and heritage. Thus, Meccan opposition to Islam was not simply a religious disagreement. It was a comprehensive resistance to a movement that threatened to overturn their economic stability, social hierarchy, and cherished ancestral traditions. As the public preaching continued, so too did the persecution of the early Muslim community, often targeting those who were most vulnerable. Among them was Bilal ibn Rabah, an enslaved Abyssinian whose steadfast faith became a symbol of early Islamic resilience. His master Umayyah ibn Khalaf subjected him to brutal torture, attempting to force him to renounce his new beliefs. Bilal would reportedly be laid out on the scorching desert sand under the midday sun, a heavy stone placed on his chest, while Umayyah demanded he utter the names of the Meccan idols. Yet, through this excruciating ordeal, Bilal's only response, delivered with unwavering conviction, was the single word, Ahad, meaning one, a powerful declaration of divine unity. Bilal's story serves as an emotional anchor, highlighting the immense human cost borne by those who embraced Islam in its earliest days. Other early converts also faced extreme suffering. The family of Ammar ibn Yasir, who were among the first to openly declare their faith, endured horrific treatment. Ammar's parents, Yasir and Sumayya, were tragically killed for their refusal to recant, making them, according to Islamic tradition, the first martyrs of Islam. These accounts, while presented with due historical caution, vividly convey the genuine danger and brutal reality faced by early Muslims at the hands of the Meccan establishment. In the face of this escalating persecution, the early Muslim community developed strategies of patient endurance, often guided by Muhammad's counsel. Wealthier Muslims, particularly Abu Bakr, played a crucial role, using their resources to alleviate the suffering of the most vulnerable. Abu Bakr famously purchased the freedom of several enslaved converts, including Bilal, who were being subjected to torture by their masters. This act of practical solidarity exemplified the deep bonds forming within the nascent community, where members used their privilege to protect those without. As the pressure mounted, a significant number of Muslims sought refuge abroad. In a remarkable act of interfaith hospitality, a group of Muslims migrated to Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, where the Christian king, the Negus, offered them protection from Meccan aggression. This migration underscored both the extreme vulnerability of the early Muslim community and the universal appeal of their message, capable of winning sympathy even from those outside the Arabian religious tradition. Tradition recounts the Negus's profound response upon hearing Quranic verses about Jesus and Mary, stating that the difference between what Muhammad taught and what Christians believed was no greater than a line drawn in the dust, highlighting a shared monotheistic heritage. Throughout this period of intense persecution, Muhammad himself remained under the steadfast protection of his uncle, Abu Talib. As the respected head of the Banu Hashim clan, Abu Talib was bound by the ancient tribal custom of extending protection to his nephew, regardless of his personal religious beliefs. He upheld this obligation consistently, even in the face of immense pressure and increasingly urgent demands from the Meccan leadership to withdraw his patronage. This dynamic illustrates the complex interplay between tribal loyalty and religious conviction in early Meccan society. Abu Talib, who never embraced Islam, nevertheless shielded Muhammad because his clan demanded it. His unwavering protection was the sole barrier standing between Muhammad and the kind of open violence that his opponents were increasingly eager to employ. This tribal political dimension was critical to the early Islamic movement, and the stability it provided foreshadowed the devastating consequences that would inevitably follow once Abu Talib's protective presence was removed. The Quranic revelations, as understood in Islamic tradition, unfolded over approximately 23 years of Muhammad's prophetic mission, a continuous process. Unlike the centuries-long composition of the Hebrew Bible, Muslims believe the Quran to be the direct, unmediated word of God, communicated through Muhammad. Early Islamic sources describe Muhammad's physical experience. He would sometimes enter a trance-like state, sweat profusely, and hear a sound akin to a bell. Afterward, he would dictate the words to scribes. Simultaneously, these verses were committed to memory by the nascent Muslim community. In a society where literacy was not widespread, the Quran's primary form was oral. It was a text to be recited, heard, and memorized, rather than solely read. Even scholars who approach the Quran without sharing Muslim theological convictions consistently acknowledge its extraordinary literary power. The early surahs or chapters revealed during Muhammad's time in Mecca exhibit a compressed, intense poetic force, characterized by short verses, vivid imagery, urgent moral declarations, and a rhythmic quality that made them both memorable and deeply impactful. Consider Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening, often recited in daily prayers. All praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful, sovereign of the day of recompense. It is you we worship, and you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those upon whom you have bestowed favor, not of those who have evoked wrath, or of those who are astray. or the powerful declarations in Surah Al-Ikhlas, the sincerity, affirming divine oneness. Say, He is Allah, one Allah, the eternal refuge. He neither begets nor is born, nor is there to him any equivalent. The Quran's distinctive voice directly addresses the listener, often using the natural world as evidence of divine power and insisting on the reality of judgment, while passionately advocating for the poor and marginalized. This literary quality was not merely incidental. It formed a central element of Muhammad's prophetic claim. He consistently challenged his opponents to produce anything comparable, a challenge known in Islamic tradition as the *tahadi*, which was never successfully met. Thematic development within the Quranic message evolved significantly over Muhammad's prophetic career. Broadly distinguishable into Meccan and Medinan periods, the Meccan surahs, revealed during years of persecution and opposition, primarily established theological foundations: the oneness of God, the reality of the afterlife, individual moral obligations, and narratives of earlier prophets. The Quran presents figures like Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and others not as isolated historical figures, but as part of a continuous prophetic tradition, with Muhammad serving as the final link. This framework was more than a theological assertion, it was a historical argument. Muhammad presented his mission as the culmination of a divine project stretching back to the dawn of human history, and his message as the restoration of an original monotheism that humanity had repeatedly corrupted. The social and ethical teachings of the Quran directly challenged the prevailing values of Meccan society. Its repeated commands to care for orphans, to feed the poor, to free enslaved people, to deal honestly in commerce, to treat women with justice, and to resist the accumulation of wealth at the expense of others were not secondary directives, but central tenets. The Quran's profound emphasis on the welfare of orphans serves as a particularly poignant example. Revealed through a man who was himself an orphan, the text repeatedly and emphatically commands the community to protect and honor them, suggesting a direct connection between Muhammad's personal experience of vulnerability and the moral priorities embedded in his revelations. This observation does not reduce the Quran to mere autobiography, but helps illuminate how an individual's life experiences can profoundly shape the moral vision of a religious movement. The preservation and eventual compilation of the Quran into a single written text was a process that unfolded over decades, largely completed under the first and third caliphs following Muhammad's death. While historical debates exist among scholars regarding the precise details of this textual history, the remarkable consistency of the Quranic manuscript tradition, coupled with the enduring parallel tradition of oral memorization, provides historians with considerable confidence that the text existing today is substantially identical to what Muhammad recited. This unique status in Islamic civilization means the Quran is not merely a sacred book, but is regarded as the living, recited, and memorized Word of God, whose Arabic text has been meticulously preserved across 14 centuries, and whose recitation remains, for hundreds of millions of Muslims, the most direct possible contact with the divine. The revelation did not arrive as a finished book placed suddenly into Muhammad's hands. It came as a voice, as recitation, as a sequence of moments that entered the life of the community one passage at a time. For the first believers, the Quran was not an object resting on a shelf. It was heard before it was collected, memorized before it was bound, repeated in houses, whispered in prayer, and carried in the hearts of men and women who understood that every verse could change the direction of a life. This is why the earliest history of Islam cannot be separated from the sound of the revelation itself. Muhammad did not present a political program first, or a legal code first, or a plan of conquest first. He recited words that called people back to God, to judgment, to mercy, to gratitude, and to moral responsibility. In Mecca, these words created a new way of seeing the world. The desert was no longer only a landscape of trade routes and tribal boundaries. It became a sign of divine power. The night sky, the rising dawn, the rain after dryness, the camel, the orphan, the beggar, the scale in the marketplace, and the grave waiting for every human being all became part of a moral universe. The Quran addressed the human heart directly. It asked why people worshipped what their own hands had shaped. It asked why wealth made men arrogant. It asked why the weak were forgotten, why daughters were despised, why the poor were pushed aside, and why the powerful imagined that they would never be called to account. This was the meaning of prophethood, as Muhammad lived it in the first years, he was not simply announcing that a new religion had appeared. He was standing before his own people and telling them that their entire world had to be measured against the oneness of God. Every idol in the sanctuary, every unjust bargain, every act of tribal pride, every cruelty hidden behind custom, was now exposed to a higher judgment. That is why the message was so powerful, and why it was so dangerous. It did not merely add one belief to Meccan life, it questioned the foundation on which that life had been built. The early believers learned the revelation through repetition. Some wrote portions on available materials, others memorized what they heard, but its first form was living speech. Muhammad recited, the companions listened, and the words passed from mouth to mouth with an intensity that made memory a sacred responsibility. In a world where poetry and genealogy were preserved with extraordinary precision, this oral culture gave the new community a powerful means of protecting what it had received. The revelation shaped their prayers, their patience, and their courage. It gave language to their suffering and meaning to their endurance. For a sleep documentary, this part of the story can be imagined almost quietly. A few believers gathered under the darkness of Mecca, listening to verses that spoke of stars, mountains, graves, gardens, fire, mercy, and the nearness of God. Outside, the old city continued its commerce and ritual. Inside those small circles, a new history was forming. Muhammad was becoming, in the eyes of those around him, not only the trustworthy merchant they had known, but the messenger who carried words that none of them believed he could have invented. The path from man to prophet was therefore not a single moment alone in the cave. It was also the long unfolding of revelation in the lives of those who heard it and chose to believe. The Meccan leadership, in approximately 616 CE, imposed a social boycott upon the Banu Hashim clan, a drastic measure undertaken 3 years before the profound losses Muhammad would endure. This collective agreement among the Quraysh meant refusing all commercial dealings with the Banu Hashim, denying them vital food and supplies, and preventing any intermarriage between their members and other clans. The goal was singular: to pressure Abu Talib into withdrawing his steadfast protection of Muhammad. The entire clan, a mix of both Muslims and those who had not embraced the new faith, was forced to retreat to a narrow valley situated just outside Mecca. There, for a period stretching approximately 2 to 3 years, they endured conditions of considerable hardship. This boycott vividly illustrates the collective nature of tribal punishment in Arabian society. The entire Banu Hashim clan suffered directly because of Muhammad's actions and his message. Yet, their willingness to endure such prolonged suffering rather than abandon him stands as a testament to the deep-seated clan loyalty that persisted even in the face of religious disagreement. Traditional accounts suggest that this harsh boycott eventually crumbled when several influential Meccan leaders, moved by the sheer sight of the clan's prolonged suffering, refused to allow it to continue. Then, around 619 CE, after the boycott had finally ended but while the broader persecution of the nascent Muslim community continued unabated, a profound personal tragedy struck Muhammad: the death of Khadija. She had been an unwavering presence from the very beginning, the first heart and mind to believe in his prophetic calling. She had provided him solace and strength through the initial terror of the first revelation, sustained him during the agonizing silence of the Fatra, and consistently supported him financially and emotionally throughout years of public opposition. She was the mother of his children, his deepest confidant. The weight of this loss cannot be overstated. For Khadija was more than just a wife, she was a witness. She was the only person alive who had been present at the very moment Islam began, who had listened to Muhammad's account of his terrifying experience in Cave Hira while the fear was still fresh on his face, and who had responded with immediate and unwavering belief. With her passing, Muhammad lost not only his greatest personal support, but also his last living, direct connection to the awe-inspiring, terrifying moment of his divine calling. Within weeks or perhaps months of Khadija's death, another devastating blow fell with the passing of Abu Talib, an event that in Islamic tradition collectively marks this period as the year of sorrow. Abu Talib, Muhammad's beloved uncle, had never converted to Islam, a fact that introduced a profound tension into their relationship. He had protected Muhammad unconditionally for a decade, shielding him from the escalating hostility of the Quraysh, yet he had never accepted the very message that his protection had made possible. Muhammad reportedly made earnest attempts to persuade Abu Talib to make a declaration of faith on his deathbed, but Abu Talib, according to tradition, refused. This moment, where profound love and spiritual conviction clashed with enduring familial loyalty, is recounted as one of the most humanly painful episodes in the entire narrative. With Abu Talib's death, Muhammad lost not only a cherished family member, but also his primary protection within the intricate tribal system. In the stark language of Arabian tribal society, without a powerful clan leader willing to extend his protection, Muhammad was a man without a shield, rendered utterly vulnerable to open attack. The immediate consequences of Abu Talib's death for Muhammad's safety in Mecca were stark and immediate. The new leader of the Banu Hashim clan, Abu Lahab, initially extended his protection, a customary gesture of familial duty. However, this protection was quickly and dramatically withdrawn when Muhammad publicly declared that Abu Lahab's own father, Abd al-Muttalib, was destined for hell as a polytheist. This pronouncement shattered the fragile truce, placing Muhammad in genuine physical danger within the very city of his birth. Faced with such peril, he embarked on a desperate journey to the nearby city of Taif, hoping to find support and refuge among its leadership. This journey stands as one of the lowest points in Muhammad's prophetic career. He was received with contempt by the rulers of Taif, mocked, and summarily dismissed. As he departed the city, the townspeople reportedly set children and servants upon him, pelting him with stones until his feet bled. This moment of profound humiliation, both physical and emotional, illustrates not only the depth of Muhammad's unwavering commitment to his divine mission, but also the genuine human cost of prophetic vocation, as he understood and experienced it. Upon his return from Taif, Muhammad entered a period of intense reflection and spiritual renewal. It was during or shortly after this profound crisis that, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad experienced the Isra and Miraj, the night journey and ascension. In this extraordinary event, he was transported from Mecca to Jerusalem and then ascended through the various heavens, where he reportedly met earlier prophets and received the command to establish the 5 daily prayers. This account, while presented with careful neutrality, is celebrated as one of the most pivotal events in Islamic tradition and remains one of the most debated by historians, with Muslim scholars themselves holding differing views on whether it was a physical journey or a profound spiritual vision. Regardless of how one interprets this event, its narrative function within Muhammad's story is clear and powerful. At the moment of his greatest earthly defeat and vulnerability, he received the most extraordinary spiritual affirmation. This experience profoundly renewed his sense of mission and prepared him for the monumental transformation that was about to unfold in his life and the nascent community he led. The opportunity for a new beginning emerged not from within Mecca, but from a city nearly 200 miles to the north, then known as Yathrib. Representatives from this city had been journeying to Mecca during the pilgrimage seasons, and it was there that they encountered Muhammad and his compelling message. Yathrib itself was a community deeply fractured by internal strife, with its 2 principal Arab tribes, the Aws and the Khazraj, locked in generations of bitter conflict. These divisions had left the city yearning for a unifying figure, a leader whose moral authority and practical wisdom could mediate their disputes and restore peace. It was in this context that a series of crucial meetings unfolded at a mountain pass near Mecca, known as Aqaba. In the first meeting, a small group of Medinans, drawn by Muhammad's teachings, pledged their support. This was followed by a larger delegation, who, after hearing his message and understanding the dire need for a leader in their own city, formally invited Muhammad and his fledgling community to migrate to Yathrib. This invitation was not merely an offer of refuge from persecution, it was a genuine political summons, a recognition of Muhammad's potential to transform a fractured city. His acceptance of this invitation fundamentally altered his trajectory, shifting him from a persecuted preacher to the leader of a burgeoning community, now with the promise of territory, resources, and burgeoning political authority. The migration itself, known as the Hijra, commenced quietly in 622 CE, unfolding over several weeks as the Muslim community departed Mecca in small, inconspicuous groups. Muhammad, ever watchful, remained among the last to leave. His departure, however, was far from quiet. It was steeped in peril. The Meccan leadership, having uncovered the migration plan, reportedly orchestrated a desperate plot. They gathered a group of young men, each drawn from a different clan, with the intention of assassinating Muhammad simultaneously. This strategy was designed to diffuse the blood guilt across so many clans that no single one could realistically seek revenge. Islamic tradition recounts that Muhammad was divinely warned of this plot. Under the cloak of night, he slipped away from Mecca with his close companion, Abu Bakr, seeking refuge for 3 days in a secluded cave along the migration route. The traditional accounts often speak of a miraculous spiderweb spun across the cave's entrance and a dove's nest laid there, which, upon discovery by the searching Meccans, convinced them that no one could have recently entered, thus ensuring Muhammad's safety. While presented with a neutral understanding, this narrative holds profound significance within Islamic tradition, serving as a powerful testament to divine protection and guidance in moments of extreme vulnerability. Muhammad's arrival in Medina, the city now known by its new name, Madinat al-Nabi, or City of the Prophet, stood in stark contrast to his furtive departure from Mecca. The entire city, men, women and children, thronged the roads, their faces alight with anticipation, eager to welcome the man whose coming they had so eagerly awaited. This jubilant reception marked a decisive turning point. The persecuted prophet was now undeniably transforming into a celebrated community leader. A famous story from this period highlights Muhammad's characteristic blend of practical wisdom and spiritual trust. When it came to selecting the site for his mosque, he allowed his camel to wander freely, declaring that it was acting under divine guidance. The camel eventually knelt on a specific piece of land, which then became the revered site of the Prophet's mosque, one of the most sacred places in Islam to this day. This act underscored Muhammad's reliance on divine will even in practical matters, demonstrating a leadership grounded in both earthly wisdom and profound spiritual insight. In the initial months following his arrival, Muhammad meticulously crafted a foundational document known as the Constitution of Medina. This remarkable text, considered one of the earliest surviving political constitutions in world history, meticulously outlined the rights and obligations of the diverse communities residing within the city. These included the Muslim migrants from Mecca, known as the Muhajirun, the local Medinan converts to Islam, called the Ansar or Helpers, and importantly, the Jewish tribes of the city. The document's most striking feature was its explicit recognition of religious pluralism. It declared that all signatory communities constituted one ummah, a single overarching community, while simultaneously safeguarding the right of the Jewish tribes to practice their own religion and to be governed by their own laws in matters of personal status. This Constitution of Medina reveals that the political vision of early Islam was not merely about imposing a singular religious identity onto a diverse population. Instead, it articulated a sophisticated, pluralistic framework designed to enable different religious communities to coexist harmoniously under a shared political authority, a testament to an inclusive political ethos. Further solidifying the nascent Muslim community in Medina, Muhammad instituted a powerful system of brotherhood between the Meccan migrants, the Muhajirun, and the Medinan converts, the Ansar. Each migrant was formally paired with a Medinan host, establishing bonds of brotherhood that transcended mere hospitality. These bonds were intended to facilitate the integration of the newcomers into Medinan society, providing them with essential economic and social support as they worked to establish themselves in their new home. This institution vividly illustrates one of the most distinctive features of the early Islamic community: its deliberate construction of social ties that consciously superseded traditional tribal and ethnic boundaries. It forged a new kind of community, one organized around a shared religious identity rather than the long-standing ties of blood or lineage. This was not simply a pragmatic arrangement, it was a profound theological statement. Within the burgeoning community of Islam, the bond of faith was intended to be stronger, more enduring, and more unifying than the ancient, often divisive bond of blood. The shift from being a persecuted minority to a politically organized community in Medina brought with it not only new opportunities, but also profound new responsibilities. Among them, the defense of the community itself. The leadership in Mecca continued to view the burgeoning Muslim community as an existential threat, particularly as the vital northern trade route to Syria, Mecca's economic lifeline, now passed uncomfortably close to Medina. While earlier Meccan revelations had emphasized patience and endurance in the face of adversity, the Medinan period introduced the concept of legitimate defensive warfare. These new Quranic permissions allowed for armed conflict specifically against those who had expelled the Muslims from their homes and continued to wage war against them. This development must be understood within its specific historical context, as the question of when and how religious communities are justified in using force is a complex ethical dilemma that every major religious tradition has confronted and grappled with throughout history. The Battle of Badr in 624 CE stands as the first major military engagement between the fledgling Muslim community and the Meccans, an event celebrated in early Islamic history for its dramatic outcome. A Muslim force, numbering approximately 300 men, intercepted a Meccan caravan. This caravan, however, was guarded by a much larger Meccan army that had marched out to protect it. The human element of this encounter was profound. The small Muslim contingent faced overwhelming odds, their fear palpable. Tradition recounts Muhammad's earnest prayer on the eve of the battle, seeking divine assistance. Against all expectations, the battle culminated in a decisive Muslim victory. Badr reverberated with immense psychological and theological significance for the early Muslim community. It was widely understood as a divine confirmation of their mission, tangible evidence that God was actively supporting their cause. Yet, this victory was not without its cost. There were casualties on both sides, and prisoners were taken. Muhammad's reported treatment of these captives, offering them fair terms for release or even education, was notably humane by the harsh standards of 7th century warfare. The following year, in 625 CE, the Battle of Uhud presented a starkly different outcome when a Meccan force of 3,000 men marched on Medina. The Muslim army suffered a significant reverse, an event that illuminates the more complex and challenging dimensions of the early Islamic military experience. A strategic error by a contingent of Muslim archers who abandoned their assigned position on a hill overlooking the battlefield allowed the Meccan cavalry to flank the Muslim lines. This tactical misstep led to chaos and heavy losses, including the death of Muhammad's beloved uncle Hamza. During the intense fighting, Muhammad himself was wounded, and a rumor spread through the battlefield that he had been killed, further demoralizing his followers. The Quranic response to Uhud is particularly insightful. It acknowledged the defeat with an unusual honesty, using it as an occasion for profound reflection on human fallibility, the nature of divine testing, and the critical importance of discipline and unity within the community. Uhud serves as a powerful illustration of the Quranic worldview. Unlike many religious narratives that present their community's history as an unbroken tapestry of divine favor, the Quran engages directly and candidly with defeat and failure, drawing vital moral and theological lessons from moments of weakness and setback, just as it does from moments of triumph. 2 years later, in 627 CE, the Battle of the Trench unfolded when a formidable coalition of Meccan and tribal forces, numbering approximately 10,000 men, besieged Medina. Muhammad's innovative response to this overwhelming threat was to have a deep defensive trench dug around the exposed northern approach to the city. This ingenious tactic, reportedly suggested by a Persian convert named Salman al-Farsi, was entirely unfamiliar in Arabian warfare. The Battle of the Trench highlights several crucial themes: Muhammad's pragmatism and his willingness to adopt effective innovations regardless of their cultural origin, the remarkable solidarity of the Medinan community as they endured a prolonged siege, and the complex diplomatic dimensions of the conflict. This period also saw the controversial and deeply painful episode involving one of the Jewish tribes of Medina, the Banu Qurayza, who were accused of violating the constitution of Medina by colluding with the besieging forces. The subsequent punishment they received is an episode addressed with historical seriousness, acknowledging its difficulty while providing the tribal political context that early Islamic sources used to explain it, emphasizing the perceived breach of trust during a moment of existential threat to the nascent community. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah in 628 CE stands as one of Muhammad's most remarkable achievements as a political and strategic leader. When Muhammad led a group of Muslims toward Mecca for the purpose of pilgrimage, they were blocked by the Meccan army at a place called Hudaybiyah. Rather than engaging in battle, Muhammad negotiated a treaty that many of his followers found deeply disappointing. It stipulated that the Muslims would have to return to Medina without performing the pilgrimage that year, agree to a 10-year truce, and accept terms that on the surface appeared to favor Mecca. The distress and frustration among the Muslim community at these seemingly disadvantageous terms were considerable. Yet, Muhammad insisted that the treaty was, in fact, a great victory. His strategic foresight proved correct. The treaty ushered in a period of relative security during which the Muslim community grew dramatically, both in numbers and influence. Crucially, it implicitly recognized the Muslim community as a legitimate political entity, moving beyond their previous status as a mere band of exiles. Moreover, the truce opened the way for the peaceful conversion of many Meccans who had previously been prevented from encountering the Muslim message due to the ongoing hostilities. This episode powerfully illustrates Muhammad's profound strategic vision and his willingness to endure short-term perceived humiliation in pursuit of far-reaching long-term goals. The peace established by the Treaty of Hudaybiyah proved to be short-lived, broken by the very parties who had pledged to uphold it. Meccan allies, specifically the Banu Bakr, launched a brutal attack on the Banu Khuzar, a tribe that had entered into an alliance with the Muslims. This act was a clear and undeniable violation of the treaty's terms, providing Muhammad with the justification and opportunity for a decisive military campaign, one that had been carefully prepared for years in strategic terms. The Muslim army that gathered for this momentous undertaking numbered approximately 10,000 men. This was an astonishing display of strength, a stark contrast to the handful of fearful believers who had once gathered in the house of Al-Hakam, seeking refuge from Meccan persecution a mere decade and a half earlier. The transformation was profound. From a small beleaguered community struggling for survival in a hostile city, they had grown into a formidable military and political power, capable of fielding an army large enough to overawe even the most powerful city in Arabia. One can only begin to imagine the complex emotions that must have stirred within Muhammad as he prepared to return to the very city from which he had once fled in the dead of night, his feet bleeding from the journey. The entry of the Muslim army into Mecca was remarkably characterized by very little bloodshed. The Meccan leadership, confronted with an overwhelming force and having received prior assurances of safety from Muhammad, offered only token resistance. Muhammad himself entered the city riding on his camel, his head bowed in an attitude that traditional sources describe not as triumphalism, but as one of profound humility and gratitude. This iconic image, one of the most enduring in early Islamic history, offers a powerful reflection on the character of a man who had endured relentless persecution, forced exile, the agonizing deaths of those he loved, and years of arduous warfare. Yet, he entered his home city not with a thirst for vengeance, but with a spirit of profound forgiveness. Regardless of one's personal views on the religious claims involved, this moment stands as one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of the capacity for mercy in the exercise of power. Muhammad extended a general amnesty to the people of Mecca, an act vividly recounted in traditional sources through a poignant exchange. He reportedly gathered the Meccan leaders before him and posed a direct question: "What do you think I will do with you?" Their reply, steeped in apprehension and hope, was, "We hope for mercy, O noble brother, son of a noble brother." To this, Muhammad is said to have responded with words that have echoed through Islamic tradition ever since: "Go, for you are free." The significance of this amnesty cannot be overstated, especially when viewed against the backdrop of 7th century Arabian norms. The conventions of tribal warfare of that era would have entirely entitled the victorious force to enslave the defeated population, confiscate their property, and exact brutal revenge for the years of persecution and violence that had been inflicted. Instead, Muhammad's reported decision was to forgive almost universally, with only a very small number of individuals, specifically identified for past egregious acts, being excluded from this sweeping pardon. This episode helps illuminate why Muhammad's character, his exemplary conduct as much as the theological message he conveyed, became so central to the rapid growth and enduring appeal of the early Islamic movement. Following the amnesty, Muhammad proceeded to the Kaaba, where he performed the circumambulation and then oversaw the removal of the idols. According to traditional accounts, he entered the sacred structure, touched the black stone, and then commanded the destruction of the hundreds of idols that had been housed within and around it. As each idol fell, he reportedly recited a powerful Quranic verse: "The truth has come, and falsehood has departed. Indeed, falsehood is ever bound to depart." This moment carried immense religious significance within Islamic tradition, signifying the restoration of the Kaaba to its original purpose as a monotheistic house of worship, believed by Muslims to have been built by Abraham and Ishmael. Historically, this act also marked a pivotal development for Islamic practice. Mecca and the Kaaba would henceforth become the eternal focal point of Muslim prayer and pilgrimage, with the direction of Mecca, the Qibla, orienting Muslim worship across the entire globe. The conquest was swiftly followed by a mass conversion among the people of Mecca, marking a crucial turning point in the broader Islamization of the Arabian Peninsula. With the fall of Mecca, the religious and political landscape of Arabia shifted dramatically. Tribal delegations from across the peninsula began to arrive in Medina, pledging their allegiance to Muhammad and embracing Islam, a period that Islamic tradition refers to as the Year of Delegations. This development invites reflection on the complex interplay between religious conviction and political pragmatism. In the conversions of this era, historians have long debated the extent to which the rapid spread of Islam across Arabia between 629 and 632 CE represented genuine spiritual transformation versus a pragmatic alignment with the burgeoning new political power. It is most probable that both factors were present in varying degrees, reflecting the diverse motivations of individuals and tribes. This complexity, however, does not diminish the profound significance of what had occurred. Within a single generation, a man who had been driven from his home city in fear for his life had returned to permanently transform it, setting in motion a cascade of events that would reshape the entire Arabian Peninsula. From the conquest of Mecca until his death in 632 CE, Muhammad oversaw a period of intense consolidation. The man who had once received revelation in fear and solitude now stood at the center of a community that had to be guided, organized, corrected, and held together. Yet the heart of the story still remained the same. The prophet was not merely ruling a city or commanding followers. He was continuing the mission that had begun in the cave of Hira, calling people to the worship of one God and to a life shaped by justice, mercy, prayer, and accountability. After the opening of Mecca, delegations came from across Arabia. Some came out of conviction, some out of diplomacy, and some because the balance of power had changed beyond dispute. The old tribal world was not erased in a single moment. It had to be redirected. Muhammad received envoys, explained the message, appointed teachers, sent representatives, settled disputes, and tried to bind many different groups into a single moral community. This was one of the most demanding parts of his prophethood. Revelation was no longer heard only by a small circle of believers under pressure in Mecca. It now had to shape markets, treaties, families, worship, leadership, and the behavior of tribes who had recently been enemies. This final period also shows why Muhammad's becoming prophet cannot be reduced to one dramatic scene. The first revelation made him the recipient of a divine call, but the years that followed revealed what that call required. He had to endure mockery, exile, war, grief, victory, and responsibility without losing the central message. In the last years, he insisted that success should not become arrogance. The conquest of Mecca was followed not by revenge but by amnesty. The destruction of idols was followed by the reorientation of the sanctuary toward the worship of God alone. Power, in this story, was meant to serve revelation, not replace it. Beyond public duties, these years remained deeply human. Muhammad experienced exhaustion, illness, family tenderness, and sorrow. He had known the death of Khadijah, the companion who had first believed him when he was afraid. He had buried children. He had watched companions suffer and die. He had carried the burdens of leadership while still praying through the night, asking forgiveness, and reminding people that no human being, not even a prophet, belonged permanently to the world. This mixture of grandeur and vulnerability is essential to the documentary tone of his life. The Prophet of Islam is presented in the tradition as both messenger and man, receiving revelation, but also grieving, smiling, forgiving, consulting, and feeling pain. In 632 CE, Muhammad performed what became known as the farewell pilgrimage. The journey gathered a vast number of Muslims and placed the rituals of pilgrimage within the monotheistic vision he had preached since Mecca. The rites connected the community to Abraham, to the ancient sanctuary, and to the idea that worship was older than tribal possession. On the plain of Arafat, he delivered a sermon remembered as one of the defining statements of his mission. Its themes were simple and immense: the sanctity of life and property, the rejection of revenge, the dignity of women, the importance of trust, the brotherhood of believers, and the equality of human beings before God. No Arab was superior to a non-Arab, and no non-Arab to an Arab, except in piety and righteousness. In that sermon, the moral message that had begun in Mecca was spoken to a community large enough to carry it beyond him. The farewell pilgrimage gave the story a sense of completion. The sanctuary had been cleansed of idols. The tribes of Arabia had heard the message. The believers had been taught how to pray, fast, give, judge, reconcile, and make pilgrimage. But completion did not mean ease. Soon after, Muhammad fell ill. The illness deepened, and the community sensed that a turning point was approaching. The man whose voice had recited revelation, settled disputes, led prayers, and comforted the frightened was now physically weakened. The atmosphere in Medina became heavy. Companions who had faced battle with courage struggled to imagine a world without him. During his final illness, Muhammad continued to think of the community. He urged prayer. He warned against turning graves into objects of worship. He reminded people to treat those under their authority with care. He asked that debts be settled and that no one should claim he had wronged them without being given the opportunity to speak. These details matter because they bring the grand narrative back to personal accountability. The prophet who had challenged Mecca's arrogance ended his life still concerned with humility before God and fairness toward people. When Muhammad died, the shock was overwhelming. Some companions could not accept it at first. The one who had led them from persecution to community, from exile to return, from fear to confidence, was gone. According to the traditional account, Abu Bakr entered, confirmed the death, and then addressed the people with words that restored the center of the faith. Whoever worshipped Muhammad should know that Muhammad had died, but whoever worshipped God should know that God lives and does not die. This moment is crucial for the title because it clarifies the meaning of prophethood. Muhammad was not worshipped by his followers. He was the messenger who called them to God. His death did not end the message because the message had never depended on his physical permanence. The immediate question of leadership would soon confront the community. But for this story, it is enough to understand the transition without moving into later sectarian history. The age of revelation had ended. The age of preservation, memory, and communal responsibility had begun. Those who had heard him now had to live without his voice. Those who had prayed behind him now had to maintain the prayer. Those who had watched mercy at the conquest of Mecca now had to decide whether they would practice mercy themselves. In that sense, the final years do not pull the story away from how Muhammad became prophet. They complete it. They show that prophethood was not only the reception of revelation, but the patient embodiment of that revelation until the end of life. For the listener, the final image is not only a leader at the height of influence, it is also the seeker of Hira who remained, beneath every title, a servant of God. The path that began with trembling became a life of proclamation. The voice that first heard recite became the voice through which a community learnt its prayers, its duties, and its hope. And when that voice fell silent, the words remained. By the end of Muhammad's life, the question asked by this story had been answered in history. How did Muhammad become the prophet of Islam? He became so through a chain of experiences that began long before the cave of Hira, through orphanhood, through the discipline of trade, through a reputation for honesty, through marriage to Khadijah, through solitude, through fear, through reassurance, through revelation, through rejection, and through the slow formation of a community willing to live by the message he recited. His prophethood was not presented as a sudden rise to earthly power. It unfolded through vulnerability, patience, and the repeated demand to speak when silence would have been safer. The early Islamic story is therefore not only the story of doctrines taking shape, it is the story of a human being transformed by a call, and of a society transformed by the response to that call. In Mecca, Muhammad stood almost alone against the habits of his people. In Medina, he became the center of a new community that had to pray, trade, judge, defend itself, reconcile tribes, and turn revelation into a way of life. The same man who trembled after the first encounter with Gabriel eventually guided a movement that changed Arabia, yet the emotional center of the narrative remains the beginning, the quiet search for meaning, the descent of the angel, the first words recited, and the realization that the life of one merchant from Mecca would never be private again. This is why the title belongs to the story. It is not simply a biography of Muhammad, and it is not a full history of later Islamic empires. It is the account of how a man known as Al-Amin came to be recognized by his followers as the messenger of God, and how the first Islamic community grew around that claim. Everything that came afterward drew strength from those first moments. The voice in the cave, the comfort of Khadijah, the loyalty of the first believers, the resistance of Mecca, the endurance of persecution, the migration to Medina, and the return to the sanctuary purified of idols. The legacy can be described without rushing far beyond the early period. Muhammad left behind a community shaped by prayer, charity, fasting, pilgrimage, recitation, and the conviction that God was one. He left behind memories preserved by companions who had watched him as husband, father, judge, commander, neighbor, and worshipper. He left behind a revelation that Muslims would continue to recite in the same language in which it first moved through Meccan nights and Medinan streets. Above all, he he left behind a model of prophethood rooted in both transcendence and ordinary human life. To fall asleep to this story is to let it settle into its simplest shape. A child without parents, a merchant trusted by his city, a seeker alone on a mountain, a frightened man comforted by his wife, a messenger opposed by his people, and a community born from words recited in the dark. From that beginning came early Islam. From that beginning came a civilization. But the heart of the story remains the moment when Muhammad, in the silence of Hira, was called to recite. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The corrected version keeps the focus on Muhammad's path to prophethood and the first Islamic community. The focus remains on revelation, Mecca. This keeps the focus on the beginning of Islam, where the meaning of prophethood first became visible. This keeps the focus on the beginning of Islam, where the meaning of prophethood first became visible. This keeps the focus on the beginning of Islam, where the meaning of prophethood first became visible. This keeps the focus on the beginning of Islam, where the meaning of prophethood first became visible. This keeps the focus on the beginning of Islam, where the meaning of prophethood first became visible. This keeps the focus on the beginning of Islam, where the meaning of prophethood first became visible. The story remains centered on revelation, Mecca, Medina, and the first believers.